The Long Night.
A sleep story of the ancient world, drawn from the songs of ice and fire.
A note on this telling. Some of what follows is confirmed by the surviving chronicles of Westeros. Some of it is tradition, what the people of that world have long believed without certain proof. Some of it is legend, old songs whose truth cannot now be tested. And some of it is theory, the quiet guesswork of maesters and singers, offered gently and never as fact. This telling will try to walk that difference honestly, the way an old historian might, sitting by a low fire, careful not to promise more than the past can give. Close your eyes if you like. None of this needs to be watched. It only needs to be heard, the way it was always meant to be heard, in the dark, before sleep, the way children in the north have heard it for 10,000 years.
Part 1. The World Before the Darkness. Chapter 1. Before Westeros had kings. Long before there were kings in Westeros, before there were castles or roads or names carved into stone, there was only the land itself, vast, green, and endlessly quiet. It is worth pausing here, at the very beginning, to imagine that world properly, because it is so easy to picture Westeros as it later became, a land of 7 kingdoms, of banners and sigils, of a great wall in the north, and a great capital in the south. But none of that existed yet. There was no Iron Throne, because there was no iron taken from dragons, because there were no dragons yet in Westeros at all. There was no King's Landing, no Winterfell as it would come to be known, no wall stretching from sea to sea. There was only forest and mountain and river, stretching on and on beneath a sky that had never known a banner. The maesters who study these things, and it must be said plainly because this will matter again and again in this telling, that almost everything from this period survives only in fragments, in songs half remembered and stories passed mouth to mouth for thousands of years. The maesters believe that in this age, Westeros belonged to no one, in the way later ages understood belonging. It belonged, if it belonged to anyone, to the trees. Weirwoods grew everywhere in that world, pale-barked and red-leaved, their carved faces watching over silent groves. Groves that would, in later ages, be cut back to small, sacred remnants, a godswood behind a castle wall, a single old tree in a forgotten yard, were then simply the forest itself, unbroken, running from one end of the land to the other. It is hard now to imagine a Westeros so wooded that a man might walk for 100 leagues and never leave the shade of ancient trees. But that is the world this story begins in. The rivers ran clean and cold, unnamed, because there was no one yet to give them names in a tongue that would survive to be written down. The mountains stood the same as they stand today, for mountains do not change quickly, whatever else does. But no road climbed them, no watchtower crowned them. In the far north, beyond even where the wall would one day rise, the land grew colder and stranger, and it was there, the oldest stories say, that something old and inhuman was already stirring, long before humanity ever crossed the narrow sea. This was the world of the children of the forest. They are called children in every surviving account, though this may say more about how later ages saw them than about what they truly were.
They were small, smaller than the first men who would come after them, with large, dark eyes suited to the dim light beneath the forest canopy, and skin the maesters describe, according to tradition, as dappled like a doe's, brown and green and mottled, so that a child of the forest standing still among the leaves might vanish from sight entirely. They were not new to Westeros even then. Every tradition agrees that they were old beyond memory, that they had lived among the weirwoods since a time so distant that even they, in their own oldest songs, could not say when they had first come to be. It is tempting, in a telling like this one, to rush toward the great catastrophe that gives this story its name, the long night, the darkness, the war of the dead. But that would be a mistake, and not only because a sleep story should never rush. It would be a mistake because the long night cannot be understood without first understanding the long peace that came before it, the world that would be lost, however briefly, and the world that fought, in its own strange and desperate way, to have it back. So let this first chapter be slow. Let it simply sit in that ancient world a while longer, before anything is threatened at all. Picture, if you will, a river valley somewhere in what would later be called the Riverlands, though it had no such name then. The water moves quietly between banks thick with alder and willow.
Weirwoods stand at intervals along the ridge above, their carved eyes facing the water, watching, the way they always watched, for reasons that even the children themselves may not have fully understood, or may have understood so completely that they never thought to explain it in words that would survive. Deer move through the undergrowth. Great elk, larger than any that would survive into later ages, browse in clearings where the canopy opens. Somewhere in the deep forest, though no human eye is yet present to see it, a child of the forest sits before a weirwood, singing a song in the true tongue, a language now entirely lost, known to no living person, its sounds and meanings gone the way that so much else from this age has gone. Not violently destroyed, but simply outlived, worn away by the slow erosion of 10,000 years. This is the world before the first men. This is the world before Westeros had a history that anyone would think to write down, because writing itself was still a thing belonging to other older civilizations, far across the sea. In Valyria, not yet an empire. In the great empire of the Dawn, in the distant east, a place this telling will return to much later, when the story reaches toward its most uncertain and haunting mysteries. For now, though, let the forest simply breathe. Let the river simply run. There will be time enough for darkness.
There is always time enough for darkness in every history that has ever been told. But first, there was this, an ancient, unbroken, and very old kind of peace, existing quietly beneath a sky that had not yet learned what it would one day be asked to witness. And so, beneath the ancient trees, the first shadows began to gather. Not yet the shadows of anything to fear, but only the ordinary shadows of dusk, falling softly across a world that did not yet know it was being watched from somewhere far colder and far to the north. It is worth imagining, too, the sheer size of this early Westeros, because scale is part of what made this age feel, to those who lived through it and to those who later tried to describe it, so different from everything that came after. There were no roads, in the sense later ages understood roads. No King's Road running the length of the continent, no way stations, no bridges built to last. There were only paths, deer trails and river crossings, worn slowly by the passage of animals, and eventually by the first children who followed them. A journey that a later rider might complete in a fortnight along a proper road could take a season or more through unbroken forest, and this alone shaped the world profoundly. It meant that communities, such as they were, remained small, scattered, and largely unaware of one another, each valley and each grove its own small and self-contained world.
The seasons themselves, even then, did not follow any fixed and gentle rhythm. This is one of the strangest and most consistently attested facts about the world of ice and fire, true in every age this telling will touch upon, and true already in this earliest one. Summer and winter came and went according to no calendar a person could rely upon. A summer might last a single year, or a decade, or longer still. A winter might pass in a season, or might stretch on for years beyond counting. No one in this ancient age understood why, and in truth, no one in any later age has ever fully understood it either.
It was simply a feature of that world, as fundamental and as unexplained as gravity or the tides. And it is this same irregularity, this same deep uncertainty about how long any given winter might last, that would make the winter this story is truly about so much harder, at first, to recognize as anything other than an unusually long, but ultimately ordinary turn of the seasons. Let the forest hold this quiet a while longer, then, before the story moves forward. Somewhere in it, a doe leads her fawn along a path worn by 100 generations of does before her. Somewhere, wind moves through weirwood leaves, red and pale against a gray sky, in a sound the children are said to have believed was itself a kind of language, if only a listener patient enough could learn to hear it.
And somewhere, far to the north, past the last hills any first man or child had ever troubled to map, something colder than winter waited in a silence that had, as yet, no name. Chapter 2. The Children of the Forest. To understand the children of the forest properly, it helps to set aside, for a moment, the word children itself, because it misleads more than it explains. They were not childlike in temperament or wisdom. If anything, every tradition suggests the opposite, that they were old in a way the first men who came after them could barely comprehend. A people whose entire understanding of the world had been shaped by thousands upon thousands of years of quiet continuity, broken by nothing until the ships came. Their magic, so far as it can be spoken of honestly, was not the loud and showy magic of later ages, not fire, not dragons, not swords that burned. It was slower, deeper, rooted in green and root and stone. They carved faces into weirwood trunks, faces with red sap weeping from carved eyes like tears. And it is tradition, not confirmed fact, but a belief held by nearly everyone in the world of ice and fire, from the small folk of the north to the maesters of the citadel, that these carved faces allowed something of the children's awareness to linger in the trees themselves. Whether this awareness was memory or watchfulness, or something closer to a kind of dreaming godhood, no surviving account can say with certainty. Central to their existence were the green seers, among their own kind especially, though the gift was not theirs alone to hold. A green seer, tradition tells us, could see through the eyes of animals, could dream true dreams of things far off in place or time, and this is where legend brushes against something almost too vast to hold steady in the mind, could perhaps see through the eyes of the trees themselves, watching centuries pass as easily as a man might watch a single evening fade to night. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment, in the quiet way this story is meant to be heard. Imagine a consciousness patient enough, old enough, rooted deeply enough in the slow life of a tree, that 100 years might pass the way an hour passes for anyone else. Imagine watching the first men arrive, watching them cut down the forest tree by tree, watching your own people driven back into smaller and smaller groves, and feeling that loss not in the sharp, sudden way a human feels a wound, but in the long, aching way a forest feels a drought, one slow season at a time. The children's relationship with nature was not, so far as the old songs suggest, one of simple harmony untouched by hardship. They hunted. They used weapons, obsidian, what the world would later call dragon glass, chipped and shaped into blades and arrowheads with a skill the first men found almost eerie in its precision. They fought when they had to. But their weapons were always born of stone and glass and bone, never of metal, and this single fact, small as it seems, would matter enormously in what followed, because it meant the children could not easily meet the first men's iron with anything but craft and numbers and magic older than iron itself. Their network of weirwoods deserves a slower telling still. Tradition holds that the trees were connected, not physically in the way roots connect beneath soil, though perhaps that too, but in some deeper sense,
a network of watching and knowing that spanned the whole of Westeros. A face carved in the far north might, in some fashion no living maester can explain, share in what a face carved far to the south had witnessed. This is not confirmed. It sits somewhere between tradition and legend, resting on the testimony of those who came after and claimed to have seen it, men who dreamed through weirwood eyes centuries later, in ages closer to our own, and swore that what they saw was real. It is enough for now to say only this. The children of the forest lived a long, unhurried, and deeply rooted existence in a world that seemed to them permanent. They had no reason yet to believe otherwise. The forest had always been there. The weirwoods had always watched. And somewhere far to the north, past a boundary the children understood better than any who came after them, something old and cold had always existed too, kept, for reasons never fully explained even in their oldest songs, at a careful distance. It is tradition, though impossible to confirm with any certainty, that the green seers among the children were fewer in number even than the ordinary gift of skin changing, the ability to share a bond with a single animal, to see briefly through its eyes, and that true green seeing, the deep and lasting communion with the weirwood network itself, was rare even among a people for whom such magic was an ordinary part of daily life. A green seer was not simply gifted. A green seer paid a cost for that gift, tradition suggests, sinking so deeply into the slow awareness of the trees that they might, in time, lose something of their own separate self, their body growing still and quiet, even as their mind ranged further and wider than any single life could otherwise reach. Some traditions hold that the oldest green seers eventually became part of the weirwoods entirely, their bodies merging with root and trunk, their faces becoming, at the last, one more carved and watching face among all the others, no longer quite a person, and not yet, or not only, a tree, but something patiently and permanently in between. This telling will not claim certainty for any of this.
It belongs to the realm of tradition, and in its deeper details, to legend, stories told about the children rather than testimony from the children themselves, since so very little of what the children believed about their own nature survives in any form that later ages could directly verify. What can be said with somewhat more confidence, because later ages did encounter fragments of this practice directly, is that the weirwoods were treated by the children not merely as sacred objects, in the way a later faith might treat a holy relic, but as something closer to kin, or to elders, or to a memory too vast for any single mind to hold, and that whatever happened to the network of trees during the long night to come, it would matter enormously to how that war was ultimately fought, and to how much of it, if anything, could later be understood at all by those who survived it. Their language, called only the true tongue in every surviving account, deserves its own brief mention, if only because its complete loss is itself so telling. No first man ever learned to speak it fluently, so far as any tradition records, though a few individual words are said to have passed into early usage among those first men closest to the children. Words for particular plants, particular places, particular small magics, absorbed the way any people absorbs fragments of a neighboring tongue, without ever mastering its whole grammar.
When the last fluent speakers of the true tongue passed from the world, whenever that truly happened, an entire way of describing reality passed with them. Concepts, perhaps, that the common tongue and even the older first men's own speech had no equivalent words for at all. This telling cannot recover those lost concepts, obviously, since recovering them would require the very language that no longer exists to recover them with. But it seems worth pausing, briefly, on the particular grief of a lost language. Not merely lost words, but lost ways of thinking, gone as completely and as quietly as the children themselves would eventually go from most of Westeros, leaving behind only a name and a scattering of carved and watching faces in groves fewer people, with each passing century, still remembered how to find. Chapter 3. The Coming of the First Men. The ships that carried the first men across the narrow sea are not remembered in any surviving account with the clarity that later arrivals, the Andals, centuries after, or the Targaryens, later still, would be remembered. There was no chronicler waiting on the shore to record the moment. There was only the forest and the river, and then, one quiet morning that no living voice can now describe, there were strangers among the trees. It is worth imagining, gently, what that first morning may have felt like from either side of the encounter, since no source preserves either perspective directly, and this telling can only offer the shape such a meeting most plausibly took. A child of the forest, moving silently through undergrowth she had known her entire long life, catching sight for the first time of a creature she had no word for, a horse, larger and stranger than any animal her own people rode or kept, bearing upon its back a rider whose skin and dress and bearing marked him as belonging to no people she had ever encountered. And on the other side, a first man, stepping ashore onto a coastline that must have seemed, after whatever hard crossing brought him there, impossibly green and impossibly vast, entirely unaware that eyes far older than his own people's entire remembered history were already watching him from the tree line, weighing what his arrival might mean.
The first men came bearing bronze, for this was still an age before iron had reached Westeros in any great quantity, and they came bearing horses, an animal the children of the forest had never before seen upon their shores. They came, too, bearing something the children valued far less than metal or beast, an appetite for land, cleared land, farmed land, land that could feed a family, and then feed a village, and then feed a kingdom not yet imagined. It is tradition, though a very old and very widely trusted one, that the first men, upon arriving, did what newcomers to a fertile country have so often done in every history this world has recorded. They began, without any particular malice, simply to clear the forest. Trees were felled, fields were opened to the sun, and weirwoods, sacred to the children in ways the first men neither understood nor, at first, especially cared to understand, were cut down along with everything else. This is the part of the story the old songs linger on longest, and for good reason, because it is the hinge on which so much of what followed would turn. The children of the forest, watching their oldest and most sacred trees felled for timber and clearing, did not simply accept this quietly.
War came. A long, scattered, half-remembered war, fought not in great pitched battles of the kind later ages would fight, but in raids and ambushes across 100 years or more. The children striking from the deep woods with obsidian arrows and old magic. The first men answering with bronze and fire and sheer weight of numbers. The songs describe it, when they describe it at all, in fragments. A green seer calling down lightning upon a first men encampment. A river turned to send floodwaters through a warband. The screaming of trees, if trees can be said to scream, as axes bit into carved and weeping bark. How much of this reflects real events, and how much is the embellishment 10,000 years of retelling naturally adds to any war, cannot be known. What can be said with more confidence, because it is echoed consistently across traditions that otherwise differ from one another in almost every detail, is that neither side could win this war outright. The children could not drive the first men back into the sea. The first men, for all their bronze and horses, could not simply exterminate a people who knew every hidden path through a forest that still, in that age, covered most of the land.
Tradition also preserves, in fragments scattered across many otherwise unrelated local legends, a particular image that recurs often enough to be worth mentioning here: hands of stone, or of carved wood, said to have been left by the children at the boundary of contested ground, marking territory in a way the first men, once they came to understand the custom, learned to respect out of simple wariness, if nothing else. Whether such markers were purely practical, a boundary stone, in essence, of a kind any people might use, or carried some deeper ritual or magical significance the first men never fully grasped, no surviving account can say with confidence. But the image itself of two peoples slowly, painfully learning one another's signals well enough to at least occasionally avoid bloodshed offers a small and human counterweight to the war's otherwise grim texture. Proof, however fragmentary, that even amid a century of raid and reprisal, some quieter form of mutual understanding was already, however slowly, beginning to take root.
Tradition holds, too, that the first men's expansion was neither uniform nor especially organized in these early generations, that different bands and different chieftains pushed into different parts of Westeros at different times, so that the war with the children was never truly a single war at all, but many smaller and separate conflicts occurring simultaneously across a very large land, each with its own local rhythm of raid and retaliation, its own local losses, its own local moments of uneasy and temporary truce long before any general peace was contemplated. This matters because it means the war's ending, too, was likely gradual and uneven, rather than a single decisive turning point. One valley finding its own peace with its neighboring children years before another valley, still locked in bitter and unresolved conflict, ever heard word of it. And so, after a century or more of a war that satisfied no one and exhausted everyone, both peoples arrived, separately at first, and then together, at the only conclusion left available to them. Not victory, something rarer, and in its way something braver. Peace. It is worth dwelling a moment on what that century of war likely cost both peoples, because the old songs, understandably, tend to linger on individual moments of drama and loss, rather than on the slow, grinding attrition that probably made up most of the actual fighting.
For every remembered ambush or remembered act of green seer magic, there were surely 100 smaller and unremembered losses. A first men farmstead burned in retaliation for a felled weirwood. A child of the forest struck down by a bronze blade she never saw coming, her obsidian knife still sheathed at her side. Whole generations, on both sides, growing up knowing nothing but this uneasy and dangerous frontier between two peoples who could neither destroy nor entirely avoid one another. Tradition holds, too, that it was not only warriors and lords who finally brought this war to its end, but voices from within both peoples, urging exhaustion over pride. First men chieftains who had lost too many sons to raids from the deep wood, and children of the forest, greenseers among them, who are said to have foreseen, through whatever dreaming sight their gift allowed, a future in which continued war left both peoples too weakened to survive whatever else the world might one day ask of them. Whether any child of the forest truly foresaw the long night itself, so many centuries before it came, is a question this telling cannot answer, and one it will not pretend to answer merely because the shape of the story would be more satisfying if it could.
But it is a thought worth holding gently, all the same, that peace between the first men and the children may have been bought not only by simple mutual exhaustion, but by a deeper, wiser fear of something still waiting, patiently, further down the long road of centuries neither people could yet see clearly. Chapter 4. The Pact. The pact was struck, tradition holds, upon the Isle of Faces, a small island resting in the middle of the God's Eye, that great lake in what would later be called the Riverlands. It is said that 100 lords of the first men and 100 representatives of the children of the forest gathered there, and that this is why the number 100 was chosen, a number that would, in later ages, come to define the green men who still, according to tradition, keep watch over the Isle of Faces, even now, thousands of years later, 100 in number, always. What was agreed upon that island, so far as later ages understood it, was simple in its shape, even if the negotiations behind it were surely anything but. The first men would take the open lands for their own, the plains, the river valleys, the coasts suited to farming and settlement. The deep forests, and above all the weirwoods that remained, would belong to the children, protected from further cutting, left standing as they had stood since before either people could remember a world without them. And more than this, the first men agreed to take up the old gods of the children as their own.
This is why in every telling of Westerosi history that follows, the godswood behind a castle, the weirwood with its carved red face, the worship of nameless old powers rather than any single deity with a name and a story, this is why all of it traces back to this one agreement, struck in a lost age, upon an island in a lake, between two peoples who had fought each other bitterly, and then chosen, against every reasonable expectation history usually offers, not to keep fighting. It would be pleasant to end this chapter there, on the pact alone, on peace successfully made. And in fact, tradition holds that the peace did last, for 4,000 years by the reckoning later maesters would attempt, however uncertain such vast spans of time inevitably are when calculated backward across so many lost centuries. 4,000 years is difficult to hold in the mind. It is longer than the entire span of recorded history in many of our own oldest civilizations. And for the whole of that unimaginable span, first men and children of the forest lived, however separately in most matters, without the general and organized warfare that had marked their first century together. But peace, however long it lasts, is rarely permanent, and this pact, struck to end one kind of danger, would eventually be tested by a danger neither people had fully anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated all too well, in ways their oldest and most frightened stories only barely hint at. Because somewhere in that same span of centuries, while first men built their halls and children of the forest sang their old songs beneath undisturbed trees, something in the far north was beginning, very slowly, to stir. It would be a very long time yet before anyone understood what that stirring meant. But the old stories agree on this much. The pact was not only a peace between two peoples, it was, whether either side fully understood it at the time, a preparation, however unintentional, for something that neither people alone could possibly have survived. Tradition holds that the Isle of Faces itself was set aside, in the terms of the pact, as sacred ground belonging to neither people alone, but to the peace between them. Untouched, unsettled, its weirwoods left forever unfelled, watched over in later ages by the mysterious green men, whose numbers and nature remain, even to the maesters of the Citadel, more legend than confirmed fact.
Some travelers in later centuries claim to have glimpsed the isle from a distance and found it wreathed in mist, even on clear days, as though the island kept its own weather apart from the lake around it. Whether this is true, or simply the kind of detail that accumulates naturally around any place a whole civilization has agreed for thousands of years to leave alone and hold sacred, this telling cannot say. What matters more for the shape of the larger story is the sheer duration of the peace the pact secured. 4,000 years is not merely a long time. It is long enough that no single family's oral memory, however carefully tended, could span it unbroken. Kings rose and were forgotten. Entire lesser wars were fought and resolved and faded from memory within that span. Wars that would, in any other context, have seemed enormous, and which the passage of those 4,000 years reduced to nothing more than a name half remembered in a single old song. Against a backdrop of time this vast, it becomes a little easier to understand how something as significant as the Long Night could eventually come to feel to later generations who had not lived through it like something closer to fable than to history. Because if 4,000 years of ordinary peace could be worn down to almost nothing in memory, what chance did a single terrible winter have of being remembered with perfect clarity across twice that span, or more?
Part 2. The Age of Heroes.
Chapter 5. The Age of Heroes. After the pact came a long stretch of centuries that later ages would call the Age of Heroes, And the name itself tells you something important before a single story is even related. This was an age remembered not through careful record, but through legend, through songs sung by firesides, not unlike the one this telling imagines for you now. It is in this age that the great founding names of Westerosi history first appear. Garth Greenhand, said to have brought agriculture itself to the first men, and to have possessed a touch that made crops grow wherever he walked. Durin Godsgrief, who built Storm's End, and is said to have earned the enmity of the gods of sea and sky themselves by daring to wed a woman they desired for their own. Lan the Clever, trickster and founder of House Lannister, who is said, in the oldest and least trustworthy of the tales, to have talked the Casterlys out of their own great rock through cunning alone. And Brandon the Builder, to whom this telling will return in a chapter of his own, for his story touches most closely on the events that follow. It must be said plainly, in the spirit this whole telling has promised to maintain, that almost nothing about these figures can be called confirmed history in any strict sense. They exist in the record the way founders of ancient nations so often exist in every real-world tradition as well. Romulus and Remus, Gilgamesh, the culture heroes of 100 vanished peoples, as figures standing at the boundary between memory and myth, doing things no single mortal life could plausibly accomplish, precisely because they are meant to carry the weight of centuries of anonymous human effort on a single legendary pair of shoulders. Garth Greenhand did not, in all likelihood, personally invent farming for every people of Westeros, but someone did begin cultivating crops in a serious and lasting way during this age, and that unnamed, unremembered progress became attached over centuries of retelling to a single green-clad giant of a man whose touch made things grow. This is, in miniature, how nearly all of the Age of Heroes should be understood. Real, gradual human development, later compressed and personified into a handful of unforgettable names. And yet, and this matters for the story this telling is building toward, not everything from this age is so easily explained away as pure legend. Some structures attributed to this age still stand, or stood recently enough to be seen and touched by people who then wrote of them.
Some traditions from this age are echoed independently by peoples who, so far as anyone can tell, had no contact with one another when they first began telling their own versions of these stories. When a legend is corroborated from unexpected directions like this, it earns, if not certainty, then at least a little more weight than legend alone usually deserves. This is why Brandon the Builder deserves particular attention, and why this telling gives him a chapter entirely his own. It is worth pausing, before moving on, to consider the other legendary figures of this age a little further, because they too shaped the world the Long Night would eventually threaten. Garth Greenhand's tradition spread furthest in the south, among the river and coastal peoples who most valued his gift for making crops grow, and many great houses of later Westeros, the Tyrells, the Tarleys, the Florents among them, claim descent from him, or from his many legendary sons, a fact that speaks less to any confirmed bloodline than to how deeply the idea of Garth mattered to the identity of an entire agricultural civilization.
Durin Godsgrief's tradition, by contrast, took root along the storm-battered coast that would become the Stormlands. His tower at Storm's End, said to have been thrown down by the wrath of the gods of sea and sky, not once, not twice, but many times over, each time rebuilt a little stronger, a little more stubborn, until at last, in the version of the tale most often told, the children of the forest themselves are said to have aided in its final and unshakable construction. Even here, at the edge of pure legend, the story quietly reminds us of a deeper truth this telling has already touched upon, that the great works of the Age of Heroes were rarely, if the old songs are honest about it, achieved by mortal hands alone. Lan the Clever's story belongs to a gentler and more comic tradition. Fittingly, since cunning rather than grim endurance was always his particular gift, tales of him talking his way into Casterly Rock or slipping past locked doors in guarded halls through wit rather than force read almost as folk tales in miniature, small and delightful beside the weightier legends of builders and sufferers.
And yet, even Lan's lighter legend carries an echo of the deeper pattern running through this whole age. Cleverness, like strength or sacrifice, was remembered as a virtue worth building a whole house's identity around, because a world still recovering from one great war and not yet aware of the greater ones still to come needed every kind of survival it could find a way to celebrate. It is worth noting, too, how differently this age has been treated across the centuries by those who study it most closely. The Citadel's maesters, as a body, have long tended to regard the Age of Heroes with a particular kind of scholarly discomfort, eager to extract whatever grains of real history might lie beneath its legendary surface, but wary of endorsing any specific claim too firmly, given how thoroughly the record blurs fact and story together across this span. Singers, by contrast, have never shared this discomfort, and it is largely through their craft, passed down across 10,000 years with remarkably little institutional oversight, that these figures have survived at all in any detailed form.
This telling owes its knowledge of Garth and Durin and Lan and Brandon almost entirely to that singer's tradition, rather than to any maester's careful chronicle, a fact worth remembering as this whole story moves forward, since so much of what follows rests on exactly this same foundation, memory kept alive not by parchment and ink, but by voice and firelight, and the simple, stubborn human refusal to let an important story disappear. Chapter 6. Brandon the Builder. Of all the legendary figures of the Age of Heroes, Brandon the Builder, sometimes called Bran the Builder, a name that will matter again, much later, in ways this telling cannot yet properly explain without running ahead of itself, is perhaps the one whose legend touches most directly on structures that still exist, structures whose sheer scale demands some kind of explanation, legendary or otherwise. Tradition holds that Brandon the Builder raised Winterfell, seat of House Stark, and that he built it with such care that its walls have never truly fallen in the 10,000 years since, whatever repairs and additions later generations have made to it. Tradition holds too, and this is the claim that matters most for the story this telling is here to tell, that Brandon the Builder raised the wall itself, that vast structure of ice standing at the very northern edge of the Norn world, hundreds of feet high and hundreds of miles long, a barrier whose true purpose this telling will explain, slowly and carefully, in the chapters that follow. It strains belief that any single man, however legendary, personally quarried and stacked and shaped enough ice to build a wall of that scale. Even the oldest songs seem to sense this, and many versions of the story hold that Brandon the Builder did not work alone, that the children of the forest aided him, that giants aided him, that old magic aided him, magic perhaps drawn from the very cold the wall was meant to hold back. Some maesters, cautious as maesters tend to be, have wondered whether Brandon the Builder was not one man at all, but a title, passed down through generations of Stark ancestors, each of whom might have overseen some portion of the wall's construction across a span of decades or even centuries, their individual efforts later folded together into a single legendary builder for the sake of a better story. None of this can be resolved with confidence. What can be said, without straying into unsupported theory, is this: the wall exists. It is real, in the sense that later ages certainly experienced it as a physical, standing, undeniable structure, cold and vast and old beyond easy reckoning. And whoever built it, one man or many, aided by magic or by nothing more than extraordinary and patient labor, built it for a reason that this telling will come to slowly, the way the builders themselves may have come to understand that reason. Not all at once, but through fear and loss and the growing certainty that something in the far north needed, urgently, to be kept out. Consider for a moment simply the labor such a structure would require, set aside entirely from any question of magic. Hundreds of miles of ice, raised hundreds of feet high, is not the kind of thing built in a single season, or even, most likely, in a single lifetime. Whatever the truth behind the name Brandon the Builder, the wall as it stood in later, better recorded ages bore every mark of a project undertaken across generations. Sections that differed subtly from one another in the old records, gates and stairs added at different points along its length,
as though each generation of builders had contributed what it could before passing the unfinished work forward to the next. This, more than any single legendary figure, may be the truest shape of the story. Not one man's triumph, but an entire people's sustained and generational commitment to a single vast purpose, sustained long after any of them could still clearly remember why the purpose mattered so much in the first place. Sustained perhaps purely out of habit and inherited discipline, the way a candle is kept burning through a long night, less because anyone still fears the dark, and more because it has simply always been kept burning.
Some traditions add, in their most fantastical retellings, that the ice of the wall itself was never entirely ordinary ice, that it held some old and quiet magic worked into it during its raising, magic that would, according to these tellings, keep it from ever fully melting, even through the longest and hottest of summers. This telling cannot confirm such magic exists, and later maesters, cautious as ever, have generally treated this claim as unproven tradition rather than established fact. But it is worth noting, if only in passing, how persistently this belief has survived. A wall raised in fear of the cold, said to be held together, in part, by magic drawn from that very same cold, standing long after the fear that built it had faded, for most of Westeros, into little more than a story told to frighten children before sleep. Tradition also holds that Winterfell itself, Brandon's other great work, was built atop hot springs that still, in ages long after, warmed the castle's halls and its glass gardens even through the deepest winter, a detail that, unlike the more fantastical claims about the wall's magic, can be more easily accepted at face value, since hot springs beneath a castle are an entirely ordinary geological feature, rather than anything requiring old magic to explain. And yet, the songs rarely resist folding even this ordinary marvel into Brandon's legend, crediting his foresight or his cunning with the discovery of springs he most likely simply happened to build above, rather than sought out through any special gift. This, perhaps, is the clearest small example this telling can offer of how legend tends to work. Even where a plain and unremarkable explanation exists, ready and waiting, the old songs so often prefer to give the credit to their hero instead. Because a story about a builder wise enough to find warmth beneath frozen ground is simply a better story than one about ordinary geological luck. Chapter 7. The Ancient North.
Before this telling can properly approach the darkness at the heart of its story, it must dwell a little longer in the north as it existed in this ancient age, because the north is where the long night would be felt first and felt worst, and it deserves to be understood as a living place before it becomes a haunted one. The north, even in later, better recorded ages, was known as a vast and thinly peopled land, colder and harder than the fertile south, its people shaped by that hardness into something the rest of Westeros both respected and slightly feared. In this earlier age, the north was smaller in one sense, its castles fewer, its lords less grand, and larger in another, because the wilderness beyond any settled hall stretched further, darker, and less mapped than it would ever stretch again. The early kings of winter, ancestors of House Stark stretching back through generations no chronicler ever fully recorded, ruled from Winterfell, or from whatever earlier hall stood on that same spot before Brandon the Builder's version of it rose. Tradition holds that the Starks were closer, in this age, to the old ways of the first men than perhaps any other great house would remain, closer to the weirwoods, closer to the old gods, closer, in ways the later story will make painfully relevant, to whatever knowledge of the true North had survived from the earliest days of the Pact.
It is tradition, too, though impossible now to verify, that the ancient Starks kept close ties with the Children of the Forest long after other First Men houses had drifted from that old alliance, that Winterfell itself was built near, or perhaps upon, ground sacred to the Children, and that this closeness would matter enormously when the darkness came, because it meant the Starks, more than most, may have had some warning of what was coming, and some memory, however faint, of how it might be fought. Beyond Winterfell,
Beyond the last farms and the last watchtowers, the land grew wilder still, home to wildlings, as later ages would call the free folk who lived beyond any king's law. And beyond even the wildlings, at the very edge of the world, a cold that seemed to some of the old songs to be more than merely weather, a cold with a will behind it, a cold that watched. No one in this early age could yet say why. That certainty, or as close to certainty as this story will ever offer, belongs to the chapters that follow, when this telling must finally turn north, past even the wildest of the wildling camps, and ask what, precisely, the ancient peoples of Westeros first began to fear. Life in this ancient north, before that fear had fully taken shape, would still have been marked by a particular kind of hardness that later, softer ages in the south could scarcely imagine.
Winters, even ordinary ones, could last years in this world, and a household's survival depended on foresight practiced across seasons rather than months. Granaries filled far beyond what any single winter should reasonably require. Firewood gathered in quantities that would seem to a southern eye almost obsessive. This habit of relentless preparation, tradition holds, was already deeply ingrained in the northern peoples of this age, long before the long night gave it its most terrible justification. It is worth wondering, gently, whether this deep northern instinct for hoarding against winter, an instinct that would survive, largely unchanged for 10,000 years afterward, right down to the words every Stark since has been raised to say, was born purely of the world's naturally irregular seasons, or whether some part of it, passed down so much longer than any single memory could explain, carried forward an older and more specific dread than ordinary winter alone would account for. The old halls of this age, built of timber and stone rather than the later grander castles of Winterfell's later centuries, would have clustered close around whatever central hearth or godswood anchored a given settlement. Walls thick, windows few and small, doors built to be barred quickly and held long.
Beyond those halls, the wild north stretched on, uncounted leagues of forest and moor and mountain, home to direwolves larger than any wolf found elsewhere in the known world, to shadow cats prowling the high passes, and, at the very edges of the settled land, to peoples who would only much later come to be called wildlings, free folk who had chosen, or whose ancestors had chosen, to live beyond any king's law, closer to the old ways, and, as this story will soon make clear, closer as well to whatever had always waited furthest north of all. A brief pause here, before the story turns toward colder things. Picture the fire this telling has imagined burning beside you all this while, low and orange and steady. Picture the room around you settling into its own late-night quiet. What follows grows a little darker for a time, but it is still only a story, still only history, remembered from a very great distance, and you are still only listening, safe and warm, exactly where you are.
Part 3. The Shadow in the North. Chapter 8. The First Stories of the Others. Every old culture, it seems, keeps at least one story meant to frighten children into staying close to the fire after dark. And in the North, that story was, and remains, even in ages long after the events this telling describes, the story of the others. It is important, in approaching this part of the tale, to resist the urge to explain too much too quickly. The oldest stories did not explain much either. They spoke instead of pale shapes glimpsed at the edge of torchlight, gone before a second glance could confirm them. They spoke of a cold that came on suddenly, without wind, without warning, dropping the temperature of a room or a clearing in the space of a few held breaths. They spoke of weapons unlike any bronze or iron blade, strange and clear and colder to the touch than anything forged in fire. And they spoke, above all, of silence. Villages that stopped answering, hunting parties that went into the deep woods and did not return, and were not searched for very long, because the searchers themselves grew afraid of what they might find,
or of finding nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. These stories, so far as the earliest strands of them can be traced, seem to have circulated for a long while as exactly that, stories, half believed, more useful for keeping children close to home than for describing anything a grown warrior needed to seriously prepare against.
This telling will not pretend the ancient peoples of the North understood in these early days what they were truly facing. They did not. They had only fragments, the way anyone facing something entirely outside prior experience only ever has fragments at first. Consider how such a fear might actually spread, household to household, across a land with no roads and no easy way to compare one settlement's strange experience against another's. A hunter, returning from the deep wood, might speak of an unnatural stillness that had settled over a particular hollow, of birds that had gone silent all at once, of a cold that seemed to follow no wind he could feel. His neighbors might nod politely, put it down to nerves or an unfamiliar trick of weather, and think little more of it. Until, months later, a traveler from some distant holdfast arrived with an oddly similar tale, and only then, slowly, uneasily, might two isolated experiences begin to be recognized as two small pieces of something larger. This is very likely how any such fear actually spreads in a world without easy communication, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of similar, separately told stories, each one dismissed on its own, each one a little harder to dismiss once a second and a third and a 10th had been heard. It is worth imagining, too, the particular loneliness of the first people to actually witness something none of the old cautionary tales had prepared them for. The first hunter to see and recognize and survive an encounter with whatever pale shape moved at the edge of his torchlight, returning to a hall full of people who would, quite reasonably, want to believe he had simply been frightened by shadow and cold and an overtired mind. But fragments, gathered slowly enough, over years and then decades, began to form a shape, and the shape they formed had a name.
Chapter 9. What are the others? Here, this telling must be especially careful, because it is exactly the kind of question a listener drifting towards sleep might want answered too eagerly, too completely. And the honest truth is that even the fullest surviving accounts leave enormous gaps. What can be said with the greatest confidence, drawn from later ages when a small handful of people are recorded as having encountered the others directly and lived to describe them, is this. They appeared human-like in shape, but taller, and their flesh, where it could be seen at all beneath armor that seemed to grow from their bodies rather than being worn over them, was described as a pale, cold white, sometimes compared to milk, sometimes to bone. Their eyes were remembered, by more than one account, across more than one age, as a blue so deep and so bright it seemed to burn rather than merely to reflect light, a blue unlike anything found in a living human eye. Their weapons, tradition and later confirmed accounts agree, were unlike anything forged by human smiths. Blades of what seemed to be ice, or of some crystal colder and clearer than any glass, capable, this part is confirmed by later closer accounts, of shattering ordinary steel on contact, as though the metal itself could not bear to remain solid in the presence of that cold. Their intelligence is harder to speak of with confidence.
They were not, so far as any surviving account suggests, simple beasts acting on animal instinct. They organized. They seemed, in later encounters, closer to our own age, to communicate with one another in some fashion, though no human witness has ever claimed to understand a word of it. And their relationship with the dead, this above all else, set them apart from anything else the ancient world had reason to fear. For the others, it seems, could raise the fallen. Not gently, not as the old gods of any faith in this world are said to raise anyone, but coldly, mechanically, turning the dead of their enemies into something that could still walk, still fight,
still be sent forward into the dark to do more killing. Some accounts, from later and closer encounters, describe the others as riding, mounted upon pale, dead-looking horses or elk-like creatures that moved without the labored breath or steaming warmth any living mount would show in such cold. Whether such mounts existed in the earliest days of the Long Night as well, or whether this is a detail belonging only to later, smaller incursions of the same enemy, cannot be said with confidence, since the oldest accounts are too fragmentary to confirm or deny it either way.
What can be said is that every description of the others, across every age that has left any record at all, agrees on one point above all others, that the cold did not simply surround them, the way cold surrounds anyone standing outdoors in winter, but seemed to travel with them, intensifying wherever they drew near, as though they carried some small portion of that first endless winter within their own bodies, wherever they walked. This last fact deserves an entire chapter of its own, because it is here that the earliest fears of the North sharpen into something the ancient peoples finally had to reckon with directly. It is worth noting, too, what the old accounts consistently do not claim, because the restraint of the tradition here is itself telling. The others are never described, in any confirmed or widely trusted account, as creatures that could be reasoned with, bargained with, or appealed to through any human language. They are never shown showing mercy, nor cruelty in the sense of taking pleasure in suffering. Their violence, where it is described at all, reads as something closer to purpose than to malice, cold and utterly without the kind of anger a human enemy might at least display. This absence of anything recognizably emotional in their conduct may be, in its own way, more unsettling than any single detail of their appearance, because it denies the ancient peoples who faced them the one thing every human conflict, however terrible, usually offers, the possibility of appealing, however faintly, to something shared. There was, so far as any surviving account suggests, nothing shared to appeal to at all. Their movements, too, are described with a particular and consistent quality across many otherwise differing accounts, a silence and a smoothness that unsettled witnesses more than any sound of approach would have. No account describes the others shouting, or roaring, or making any of the ordinary noises a charging army makes. They are said to simply be somewhere they had not been a moment before, the intervening approach never quite witnessed, as though the space between one moment and the next had, for them alone, worked differently than it worked for everyone else present.
Chapter 10. The Difference Between Others and Whites.
It would be easy, hearing all of this in the abstract, to blur the others and their dead together into a single, undifferentiated horror. But the old stories, and the handful of later confirmed accounts that echo them, are consistent on one crucial point. The others and the whites they raised were never the same thing, and mistaking one for the other could be fatal. The others themselves were, so far as anything can be confirmed, a distinct and independent kind of being, not human, not once human, whatever else remains uncertain about their origin. They led. They commanded, in whatever silent fashion their kind commanded. They alone, in every surviving account, could raise the dead in the first place. Whites, by contrast, were exactly what the name suggests, the risen dead, corpses of men, and in later ages of animals as well, moving with a cold and terrible purpose that was never truly their own. A white felt no pain, tired never, and could be stopped only by fire, or by the near total destruction of its body. A blade through the flesh alone did nothing, a fact that later ages would relearn at great and painful cost when this same horror returned in the world's much later history.
This distinction mattered enormously to anyone who actually had to fight these things, because a man who believed he was fighting only the walking dead, slow, mindless, ultimately just meat in motion, might walk unknowingly into the presence of something else entirely, cold, intelligent, and armed with a blade that could shatter his sword on the very first stroke. The oldest stories of the North, whatever else time has worn away from them, preserved this warning with unusual care, passed from parent to child across 10,000 years, in a land where forgetting it, even once,
might cost a family everything. It is worth noting, too, that the relationship between an other and its whites seems, from what fragments survive, to have carried a further and stranger danger beyond simple numbers. Some accounts suggest that a white's purpose, or its awareness, was never entirely its own, but remained tied in some fashion to the other who had raised it, so that a white might act with a coordination and a purposefulness that no ordinary mindless corpse should reasonably possess.
If true, and this telling must stress that this rests on fragmentary and largely unconfirmed tradition rather than anything closer to established fact, it would mean that even a large number of whites, seemingly acting independently across a wide battlefield, might in truth be extensions of a single guiding will, making the death of the other behind them a far more urgent objective than simply destroying white after white as they came. Whether the ancient peoples of the Long Night ever fully grasped this, or whether it took later and much smaller encounters to relearn it, this telling cannot say with confidence. And it was this warning, more than any other single piece of inherited memory, that the North would cling to when the darkness finally and fully arrived. Tradition holds that this is also the origin of the North's particular and unusually strict custom of burning its dead, a practice that set the northern peoples apart from many of their southern neighbors, who more often favored burial, or among the great houses, entombment in stone. In the South, this custom was sometimes remarked upon, in later ages, as a curious northern austerity, a preference for the clean simplicity of fire over the slower rituals of the crypt. But in the North itself, among those who still remembered why the custom existed at all, it was never spoken of as mere preference. It was spoken of, when it was spoken of directly, as a debt owed to the dead themselves, a final mercy, ensuring that whatever had been a beloved father, a sister, a friend, would never rise again as something else, something with a cold blue light where warm eyes had been, wearing a face that could no longer be trusted to belong only to the person who had once worn it in life. This telling would ask you to hold that thought gently, the way it has asked you to hold so many others tonight, because it says something quietly profound about how a whole culture can carry forward the memory of an unspeakable horror long after the specific horror itself has faded into legend, not through words alone, which erode and are argued over and eventually doubted, but through a habit, a ritual, a small and unquestioned act repeated in every generation, long after most people performing it could tell you precisely why. Let the pace slow further here, if it can. What comes next is the hardest part of the whole story, not because it is more dramatic than what follows, but because it is where hope had the least to hold on to. Remember, as you listen, that this telling has already promised you an ending, and that the ending is a good one. The world you are about to hear grow cold and dark is a world that will, in time, be warm again. Part 4. The Long Night Begins. Chapter 11. The First Winter. No single date marks the beginning of the long night, because no one living through its earliest signs understood, at first, that a beginning was even occurring. This is perhaps the truest thing this telling can say about any catastrophe of this scale. It rarely announces itself. It arrives instead as a season that simply refuses to end. The old stories describe a winter that came earlier than expected, and stayed. At first, this alarmed no one especially. Winters in Westeros have never followed a fixed calendar, and even in later, better documented ages, a winter arriving without clear warning and lasting years rather than months was an accepted, if dreaded, feature of life in that world. What made this particular winter different revealed itself only slowly, the way the worst truths so often do. The days grew shorter, and then shorter still, in a way that outpaced even a long winter's usual rhythm. In the furthest northern holdfasts, tradition holds, there came a point where the sun barely climbed above the horizon at all, And then a further point, harder still to accept, where it seemed not to rise in any meaningful sense whatsoever. Snow that should have melted with the turning of a season did not melt. Rivers that had never frozen in living memory froze solid and stayed frozen.
And alongside the cold came the disappearances. A hunting farmstead that stopped sending word, its silence at first attributed to the difficulty of winter travel, and only much later, and much more fearfully, attributed to something else entirely. Villages near the edge of the wild began, one by one, to fall quiet in a way that had nothing to do with cold alone. Tradition preserves, in a handful of fragments too consistent across otherwise unrelated regions to dismiss entirely, a particular detail worth mentioning here: that animals seemed to sense the wrongness of this winter before people did. Dogs that had never before shown fear of the dark are said to have refused to leave their masters' halls after nightfall. Horses grew skittish on roads they had traveled calmly for years. Even the great elk of the deep forest, ordinarily bold enough to graze within sight of a hunting party, are said to have begun moving south in numbers and with an urgency that seasoned hunters found genuinely unsettling, long before those same hunters had any clearer reason of their own to feel afraid. Whether animals truly possess some sensitivity to this kind of unnatural cold that people lack, or whether this detail simply reflects the very human tendency to notice, after the fact, small warning signs that seem significant only in hindsight, this telling cannot say. But the detail recurs often enough in the old songs that it has become, over 10,000 years, its own small piece of inherited caution. A restless dog, a needlessly registered unease among livestock, treated in later ages not as mere superstition, but as exactly the kind of small warning worth taking seriously. It is worth sitting for a moment in the particular fear of a people who do not yet have a name for what is happening to them. Later ages would at least have this consolation: whatever horror came for them had come before, had been described in old songs, had a shape that could be recognized, even if it could not be easily fought. The people living through the first true winter of the long night had no such comfort. For them, this was new. This was the first time. And the absence of any prior example to reassure them, the absence of anyone who could say, "This happened before, and it ended," may have been, in its own quiet way, almost as frightening as the darkness itself. Imagine, too, the particular difficulty faced by whatever leaders, lords, chieftains, elders of a given holdfast, were tasked with deciding how their people should respond in these earliest and most uncertain months.
A leader accustomed to ordinary hardship has a whole inherited store of wisdom to draw upon: when to ration food more strictly, when to call in outlying households, when a difficult winter has simply gone on a little longer than usual, and when it has crossed into genuine crisis. None of that inherited wisdom applied cleanly here, because nothing in living memory, nor in the memory of a parent or a grandparent, had prepared anyone for a winter that seemed to refuse every rule a winter was supposed to follow. Some communities, tradition suggests, responded by doubling down on old and ordinary caution, gathering closer, husbanding food more carefully, assuming, reasonably enough at first, that patience alone would eventually be rewarded with a spring no different from every spring before it. Others, in scattered and largely unrecorded ways, seem to have begun taking more unusual precautions earlier than most, reinforcing walls that had never before needed reinforcing, arming households that had never before felt the need for weapons kept close to hand. Whether this earlier caution reflected some genuine intuition, some faint memory carried down through families closest to the old ways, or simply the ordinary variation in caution any large population always shows when facing an uncertain threat, cannot be known.
What is certain is that the communities who adapted earliest to the strangeness of this winter were, by every surviving account, the communities most likely to still be standing when the true nature of that strangeness finally and fully revealed itself. Chapter 12. The World Without Dawn.
There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from any single terrible event, but from the simple accumulating weight of time passing without relief. This, more than any battle or any monster, may be the truest emotional center of the long night's earliest years, and it deserves to be described slowly, because it is a fear every listener, in their own smaller way, has likely felt at some point in their own life, the fear of a difficulty that will not end. Imagine, if you will, the psychological toll of true and prolonged darkness. Not merely a long night in the ordinary sense, the kind that ends with a sunrise a person can count on, but a darkness that stretches on past the point where sunrise feels like a reasonable expectation at all. The old songs describe communities that kept fires burning constantly, day after day, because there had ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be a difference between day and night worth marking. They describe people losing track of how much time had passed, weeks blurring into what might have been months, with no sun to mark the change. Cold of this depth and duration brings its own slow erosion. Stores of food, however carefully rationed, were never meant to last through a winter with no clear end. Livestock died, or were slaughtered early rather than allowed to starve, which only worsened the longer crisis to come. And beneath all of this practical hardship ran something harder to measure, but just as real, a fraying of hope itself, a growing and quietly spoken fear in halls across the north that perhaps this winter truly would not end, that the world itself had simply stopped turning toward the light. It is against this backdrop of exhaustion, hunger, and creeping despair, and this matters because it explains so much of what followed, that the first confirmed accounts of the walking dead began to spread. A people already worn thin by cold and dwindling supplies and endless dark were, in this fashion, made especially vulnerable to the horror that came next, arriving not into a world at full strength, but into one already weakened by every ordinary hardship a long winter can bring. It is worth speaking, too, of the particular way that darkness affects a mind over long stretches of time, since this is a truth that does not belong only to legend, but to the ordinary human experience of hard winters everywhere, in every age, including our own. Sleep grows strange in prolonged darkness, too much of it, or too little, or a kind that never quite feels restful, the body's ordinary sense of day and night having nothing left to anchor itself against.
Small disagreements, in households and in halls, are said to have sharpened into larger ones, tempers worn thin by cold and hunger, and the sheer grinding sameness of a darkness that offered no change, no relief, no sense of one day being meaningfully different from the last. And grief, when it came without the ordinary comforts a community usually offers it, the warmth of a shared meal, the simple presence of neighbors gathering to mark a loss, because a community fighting merely to keep itself fed and warm had less and less to spare for grief's ordinary rituals. This telling does not linger on these details to dwell in misery for its own sake, but because it matters to understand, honestly, just how much had already been asked of these ancient peoples before the true war even properly began. Whatever courage the long night's later chapters would demand of them, it was demanded of people already stretched thin by years of an ordinary hardship that would, on its own, have counted as one of the great trials of any other age. And yet, even here, in this darkest and most exhausted stretch of the whole ordeal, tradition preserves small fragments, suggesting that some communities found ways to endure that went beyond mere survival.
Singers, the old stories say, became especially valued in this period, not for any practical skill, but simply for their ability to give shape to the passing of time through song, marking a kind of rhythm the sunless sky itself could no longer provide. A song sung every evening, whatever its content, became its own small calendar, a way of saying, another day has passed, and we are still here to mark it. This telling finds something quietly moving in that thought, that amid a darkness this total,
a people found a way to keep counting, not through the sun's rising, which had failed them, but through the simple, deliberate repetition of their own voices raised together.
Chapter 13. The Frozen World.
Before this telling turns to the war itself, let it pause once more, because this is, after all, meant to be heard quietly, in the dark, and a story meant for sleep should never rush past its most atmospheric moments, even when those moments are sorrowful ones. Picture the frozen rivers of that age, their surfaces thick enough, in places, to walk across without fear. Water that had once run free, now locked beneath ice that would not release it for years. Picture fields that had been sown in what their farmers still hoped, however faintly, might be a normal season, now buried beneath snow that never melted, the crops beneath long dead, offering nothing. Picture the animals of the wild, forced further and further south by cold and hunger. Deer and elk moving in thin, desperate herds through country that could no longer feed them, hunted by wolves grown bold with their own hunger, and hunted in turn by the last human hunters willing to venture out into a landscape that seemed less and less like the world they had known. Picture, too, the abandoned settlements, not dramatically destroyed in most of the old accounts, but simply left, doors swinging in a wind that carried no warmth, hearths gone cold because the people who had lived there had either fled south in search of safety or had simply stopped being there at all, in a way their neighbors found too frightening to investigate too closely.
And picture the forests themselves, weirwoods included, standing beneath a weight of snow that bent their branches low, their carved red faces rimed with frost, watching, if watching is truly the word for whatever it is a weirwood does, over a world that had grown suddenly and terribly unfamiliar to them as well. This is the Westeros into which the true war of the long night arrived, not a strong and confident world meeting a challenge at its best, but an exhausted, frightened, and already grieving world, meeting the worst thing it had ever faced at what may have been its very weakest moment. That the world survived this at all, and it did survive, this telling can promise you that much, without spoiling anything, for you are hearing this story now, in a world that exists, in an age long after. That survival is itself the quiet miracle at the heart of everything that follows. Let this chapter close, then, with one final image, held a little longer than the rest, because it belongs as much to comfort as to sorrow. Even in this frozen and exhausted world, tradition holds that small acts of ordinary kindness continued. A household sharing its last stores with a neighbor who had less. A child of the forest, in one especially tender fragment of the old songs, leaving obsidian arrowheads at the edge of a human settlement she had never announced herself to, a gift given without any expectation of thanks. It is easy, telling a story this large and this dark, to let the darkness crowd out everything else. But every surviving tradition insists, in its own quiet way, that kindness did not vanish from the world during the long night, even at its coldest and most frightening. It simply grew quieter and smaller, and more precious for being so hard won, which may, in the end, be exactly the kind of kindness worth remembering longest. Here, the story turns from endurance to resistance, from a people simply surviving a terrible winter to a people beginning, however uncertainly, to fight back against whatever had come to share that winter with them. It is a harder part of the telling in some ways, and a more hopeful one in others, because it is here that courage, however small and however scattered, first begins to answer the darkness.
Part 5. The War of the Dawn.
Chapter 14. The Dead Rise.
There is no gentle way to tell this part of the story, though this telling will still try to tell it calmly, because even the oldest songs, for all their horror, are sung slowly and quietly, not shouted. The confirmed accounts, and this is one of the few points in the entire history of the Long Night where later, much closer testimony exists to support the ancient tradition, because this same horror would return briefly and on a far smaller scale in an age much nearer to our own. Describe the dead rising after battle, after exposure, sometimes even after simple, ordinary death from cold or illness, provided the others had been near enough to work whatever cold and silent power let a corpse rise again. The songs do not linger on gore, and this telling will not either. What they linger on instead is the horror of recognition, the particular dread of seeing a face you knew, a companion or a kinsman buried or left in the snow only days before, standing again, moving again, but wrong. The eyes, every account agrees, were the clearest sign. A cold, unnatural blue light where a living eye had been, or where a dead one should have simply stayed closed and still. It is this horror of recognition, more than any purely physical danger, that the old stories treat as the true weapon of the others in these earliest encounters. A warrior prepared to fight an enemy is not, in the same way, prepared to fight a friend.
And it seems to have taken the ancient peoples of Westeros a painful stretch of time, measured in the old songs only vaguely as years, to learn the harder truth their descendants would relearn later, that whatever rose after death was no longer the person it had been, and that grief, however natural, could not be allowed to slow a blade meant to end that rising for good. The old songs describe, too, the particular cruelty of timing that seemed to attend these earliest risings, the dead returning not immediately in the heat and confusion of a fight where a soldier's guard might already be up, but later, sometimes much later, after a body had been laid out for mourning, after grief had already begun its slow and necessary work. A watch kept over the dead the night before a burning, tradition holds, became one of the most dangerous vigils a person could keep in this period, precisely because it was the moment least expected to hold any danger at all. Some of the oldest and grimmest fragments of tradition suggest this is the true origin of the custom, observed in the North for thousands of years afterward, of burning the dead as swiftly as possible, rather than allowing any prolonged period of mourning over an unburned body. Not out of any lack of love for the dead, but because of a fear, learned at the highest possible cost, of exactly what that unburned body might do.
What eventually turned the tide of this earliest and most confused fighting, so far as the fragments allow us to say, was not any single dramatic revelation, but the slow, hard-won accumulation of a new kind of collective knowledge. Fire kills a wight where a blade alone does not. A wight shows no pain and tires never, and must therefore be met with total destruction rather than the ordinary caution one blade shows another. And above all, the dead must be denied their rising in the first place, by fire, before the enemy who commands them ever has the chance to call them back. This knowledge, purchased at a price this telling will not attempt to specify, because no honest source specifies it either, became the foundation of everything that followed.
Chapter 15. The First Human Resistance. Resistance to this horror, in its earliest years, was neither organized nor especially effective, and the old stories are honest enough about this to be worth trusting on this point specifically, since legends usually prefer to flatter their ancestors rather than admit to early failure. The first men resisted as scattered communities resist any sufficiently large threat before they have learned to cooperate, locally, desperately, and often too late. A holdfast might arm every able body it had, might build walls of piled stone or sharpened timber, might burn its dead immediately rather than risk their rising, a practice that tradition holds began in exactly this period, and which would remain, for thousands of years afterward, one of the deepest and most carefully kept customs of the North, long after most people had half forgotten why burning the dead mattered so much. The children of the forest, for their part, resisted in their own older and stranger fashion, through the green seer's foresight, through obsidian weapons whose effectiveness against wights and against the others themselves the old songs consistently praise, and through whatever aid their old magic could offer a fight that was, in truth, unlike anything even they had faced before in the whole of their long-remembered history. What neither people achieved in these early years was anything like a unified defense.
The first men and the children, bound by the pact but still separate peoples in most practical matters, fought this new war largely apart from one another, each absorbing losses the other might have helped prevent had cooperation between them been closer. It would take a particular kind of desperation, and tradition holds a particular kind of hero, to begin changing that. It is worth imagining the particular frustration and the particular grief of two peoples who might have fought this war so much more effectively together, kept apart in these earliest years less by any real hostility between them, and more by simple habit, distance, and the ordinary difficulty of coordinating across a land with no roads and no shared central authority. A first men holdfast under siege might have been a single day's swift travel from a grove of children who possessed exactly the obsidian weapons and old magic that holdfast desperately needed, and never know it. The two communities, separated by a wall of unfamiliarity and old suspicion, thicker in its way than any distance of mere miles.
Tradition holds that it was often smaller, more isolated communities, those living closest to the boundary between first men lands and the deep, children-held forests the pact had set aside, who first began to bridge this gap in practice out of the simplest kind of necessity, a first men village too small to defend itself alone, reaching out, in desperation, to whatever children still lived nearby, a grove of children, having lost too many of their own kind to face the enemy without allies, choosing at last to trust neighbors they had, for centuries, mostly kept at careful and respectful distance. These smaller local alliances, largely unrecorded and unnamed in the surviving songs, may well have done more to prepare the ground for the larger, more famous cooperation still to come than any single grand and legendary meeting ever could.
Chapter 16. The Last Hero.
Of all the legends attached to the long night, none is more central, nor more uncertain, than the story of the last hero. The tale, as it survives in its most common form, tells of a man, unnamed in every version this telling has been able to trace, which is itself worth noting, since even legendary figures usually keep at least one name across their retellings, who set out into the depths of the frozen wilderness with a small company of companions, seeking the children of the forest, hoping that their old magic might succeed where ordinary steel had failed. The journey, as the songs describe it, was one of relentless loss. His companions are said to have died one by one, to the cold, to hunger, to wights encountered along the way, and in the darkest versions of the tale, to the others themselves, met directly in the white wilderness beyond any human road. By the story's end, the last hero is said to have traveled on entirely alone, his horse dead beneath him, his dogs gone, his sworn companions all lost, driven forward only by the desperate hope of finding the children before the last of his own strength failed. What happened when he found them, if he found them at all, is precisely where the songs stop agreeing with one another. Some versions hold that the children gave him dragon-glass weapons, obsidian shaped for a fight the first men could not otherwise win.
Some versions connect his story directly to the founding of the Night's Watch, suggesting that whatever pact or alliance he forged in that frozen meeting became the foundation for the order that would guard the realms of men for 10,000 years afterward. And some versions offer no clean ending at all, leaving the last hero's fate as uncertain as the deep snow he is said to have vanished into. It must be said plainly, in keeping with this telling's promise to itself, that the last hero cannot be confirmed as a historical figure in any strict sense. He may be legend, built entirely from hope, the story a desperate people needed to tell themselves, of one person willing to walk into the very worst of it so that everyone else might have a chance. Or he may be, as some maesters have gently theorized,
a compression of many real journeys, many real losses, many real acts of courage undertaken by unnamed people across the true history of this war, folded together, the way so much of the Age of Heroes was folded together, into a single unforgettable shape. Either way, his story endures, sung still in ages long after his own, whenever people need to remember that even the coldest and most hopeless winter has, at least in memory, always eventually ended.
It is worth lingering gently over the particular shape of this legend, because so much of its emotional power lies not in any single dramatic act, but in its slow accumulating losses. Each companion who falls along the way removes one more source of warmth, one more voice to share the burden of the journey, one more pair of eyes to watch the dark while the others rest. By the time the last hero is said to have traveled on entirely alone, the story has already, quietly, taught its listener something true about any great and difficult undertaking, that it is very often carried, in its final and most crucial stretch, by far fewer hands than began it, and sometimes by only one. Some of the older and more fragmentary versions of this tale add small details that do not survive into the more common telling. A raven, in one version, that stayed with him after his dogs had died, flying ahead to scout a path through snow too deep for him to see over. A fire, in another version, that would not go out no matter how wet the wood he fed it, as though some old and kindly magic had chosen, in the midst of so much loss, to grant him at least this one small mercy. This telling repeats these fragments not as confirmed history, but as evidence of how deeply this particular legend has been loved and reworked and quietly added to by countless tellers across countless generations, each one wanting in their own small way to give the last hero just a little more comfort on a journey the old songs otherwise describe as almost unbearably lonely. It is worth imagining, too, the particular quality of the silence he is said to have walked through in his final stretch alone. Not the ordinary silence of an empty road, but something heavier, the silence of a world that had, by that point in the war, largely emptied itself of both danger and comfort alike, the fighting having moved elsewhere, or simply having exhausted itself in that particular stretch of wilderness before he arrived. Some versions of the tale linger on this quality specifically, a man walking for days through snow untouched by any other footprint, living or dead, so that his own passage became, briefly, the only sign that anything human still moved through that frozen country at all. This image, more than any single act of heroism attributed to him, may be the truest emotional center of his entire legend. Not triumph, but sheer solitary persistence, continuing forward through a world that had, by every reasonable measure, already given him every excuse to stop.
Whether he ever truly found the children of the forest, or whether that meeting itself belongs more to hope than to history, this telling cannot resolve. But it offers this thought, gently, as this chapter closes, that the story of a single person walking alone into an unbearable darkness so that others might be spared it has been told in one form or another in nearly every culture this whole telling has touched upon tonight, Westerosi, Yetish, Ashai alike, which may say less about any one confirmed historical journey and more about a truth every frightened and hopeful people seems to need in their darkest hour to believe, that someone, somewhere, will always be willing to keep walking, even when hope itself has grown thin enough to see through. Chapter 17. The Children in the Darkness. It would be a mistake, in telling this part of the story, to imagine the children of the forest as passive figures, waiting in the depths of the wood for a lone human hero to arrive and ask for their help. The old traditions, read carefully, suggest something more complicated, and in some ways more troubling. The children, after all, had lived alongside whatever power lay behind the others for far longer than the first men had.
Some of the oldest and most uncertain fragments of tradition, and this telling must stress with real care that this rests almost entirely in the territory of theory rather than confirmed history, suggest that the children's magic and the magic of the others may have shared some deeper, stranger relationship, a common root in the same old and inhuman power of ice and cold that neither children nor first men fully understood. If there is truth in this uncertain thread, it may help explain something the old songs otherwise leave unexplained. Why the children, despite 10,000 years or more of their own history in Westeros, seem to have had no simple answer to the others when the long night came. If the two powers were kin in some fashion never spelled out in any surviving account, then perhaps no amount of the children's own magic could ever have been expected to defeat the others outright, only perhaps to help humanity survive them, and eventually to help hold them back.
This telling will go no further than that with this particular thread, because to go further would mean inventing an answer the books themselves have never given, and this story has promised from its very first chapter never to do that. What can be said honestly is only this: whatever the children of the forest knew, and whatever they did not, they chose, in the end, and at what tradition suggests was considerable cost to themselves, to stand with the first men rather than apart from them, in the war that was still, even now, only reaching its beginning. It is worth imagining, too, the particular grief the children may have carried through this war, distinct from whatever grief the first men carried, and rarely given its own space in songs composed, after all, mostly by human singers for human listeners. If the children truly understood the others, or their origins, or their nature, more deeply than the first men ever could, even if only through some faint and troubling kinship neither confirmed nor denied by any surviving source, then every child of the forest who took up an obsidian blade against them may have carried into that fight a knowledge no first man shared, the possibility that the enemy she faced was not wholly foreign to her own people's oldest history, but bound to it in some way she could neither fully explain nor fully escape.
This telling offers this only as a thought to sit with, not as an answer to settle upon, because no source confirms or denies it, and honesty matters more here than a satisfying resolution. But it is worth remembering, as this story moves forward into its accounts of the war's final and most desperate stages, that the children of the forest fought this war not as simple allies lending aid to a human crisis, but quite possibly as a people confronting something woven far more deeply into their own oldest and most private history than any first man could have fully understood at the time, or perhaps ever. The story now travels far from the north for a while, east, across the narrow sea, past Yi Ti, past the great empire of the dawn, to Ashai by the shadow, where the same darkness, or something enough like it to be mistaken for it, seems to have been remembered in an entirely different tongue, by an entirely different people, under an entirely different name. Let the fire in your mind travel there too, gently, the way old traders' tales once traveled that same long distance, growing stranger and more uncertain with every league.
Part 6. The Great Prophecies. Chapter 18. Azor Ahai. No figure connected to the Long Night has traveled further from Westeros itself, in the songs that carry his name, than Azor Ahai, a hero whose story is told not in the north, where the war itself was fought most fiercely, but far to the east, in Ashai by the shadow, and in the religion of R'hllor, the Lord of Light, whose priests would carry this legend across the known world in ages long after the darkness had passed. The tale, in its most common form, holds that a great darkness fell upon the world, described sometimes as a lasting winter, sometimes more broadly as a darkness in which even the stars themselves seemed to fail, and that only one weapon could drive it back, a sword called Lightbringer, forged by a hero named Azor Ahai. His first attempts at forging the blade are said to have failed. Tempering the sword in water shattered it. Tempering it in the heart of a lion accomplished nothing. It was only when Azor Ahai, in the darkest and most sorrowful version of the tale, plunged the blade instead into the heart of his own beloved wife, Nissa,
that the sword took true and lasting form. Her soul, the songs say, bound into the steel itself, her cry of anguish and love passing into the blade at the moment of her death, so that Lightbringer became, from that moment forward, a weapon literally forged from sacrifice.
With this sword, tradition holds, Azor Ahai fought back the darkness and, for a time at least, restored the light to the world. This telling must say clearly, because it matters enormously to keeping this story honest. Nothing about this can be confirmed as historical fact, even by the standards this telling has applied to other, less fantastical parts of the larger story. Azor Ahai belongs to religious tradition specifically, tied closely to the faith of R'hllor, and different peoples across the known world tell versions of essentially this same story under different names, a detail that will matter greatly in the chapters that follow, when this telling turns to consider whether all of these differently named heroes might, in some fashion, be describing the very same events. It is worth sitting a moment longer with Nissa Nissa, because her role in this legend deserves more than the brief mention it usually receives in the retellings that hurry past her toward the sword itself. She is remembered, in most versions, as Azor Ahai's beloved wife, and her death at his hand is remembered not as an act of cruelty in the ordinary sense, but as the terrible price the legend insists was required, a price given willingly, in some tellings, by a wife who understood, as her husband perhaps did not yet fully understand, what the moment demanded.
Other versions offer no such comfort, describing her death as simply a sacrifice made, without dwelling on her own choice or consent in the matter at all. This telling will not resolve which version is truer to whatever original story, if any single original story exists, first gave rise to this legend. But it would be dishonest and unkind to her memory across however many centuries this story has been told to let this chapter pass without at least noting that Nissa Nissa's own experience of this moment, her fear, her understanding, her willingness or unwillingness, is precisely the part of the tale that has survived least clearly of all, folded almost entirely into her husband's legend, rather than kept as anything resembling her own. Some singers, in later ages, have tried to give her back a voice within the telling, imagining what she might have known or hoped or feared in that final moment. This telling will not invent such a voice for her here, since doing so would mean inventing rather than reporting. But it seems right, at least, to notice the silence where her voice should be, rather than passing over it without comment.
Chapter 19. Lightbringer.
The sword itself deserves its own slower consideration, because Lightbringer has been understood in strikingly different ways across the ages, and no single interpretation can be called the confirmed truth. Read literally, Lightbringer is simply a sword, a physical weapon, glowing or burning in some accounts, capable of cutting through darkness, and by extension, through whatever creatures that darkness had produced. Some versions of the tale hold that the blade radiated actual heat and light, a weapon perfectly suited, in the most direct and practical sense, to fighting an enemy born of cold. Read symbolically, however, and this reading has been offered across many ages by scholars and singers alike, Lightbringer may represent something less literal, hope itself, forged through unbearable loss, the human capacity to create something meaningful, even from grief, or the idea that defeating a darkness this total requires a sacrifice so complete that it cannot be undertaken lightly or without lasting cost. The relationship between fire and darkness at the heart of this legend runs in fact through nearly every tradition connected to the Long Night, whatever name a given culture gives its version of the story. Fire defeats cold. Light defeats dark. This is, on one level, simply an old and nearly universal way for a people to describe the triumph of good over hardship, hope over despair, a metaphor so natural to nearly every human culture that its recurrence across Westeros, Asshai, and the far eastern traditions this telling will soon reach may say less about any single shared historical event than about the shared human need to imagine victory in exactly these terms. And yet, this telling must be honest about this too. The recurrence is striking enough, detailed enough, and consistent enough across cultures with no obvious contact between them,
that dismissing it entirely as coincidence feels, to many who have studied it closely, a little too easy as well. No confirmed answer exists, only the old, unresolved, and quietly fascinating question of whether these many different fires were, in some sense, always the very same fire. There is a further wrinkle to this mystery worth naming honestly, because the faith of R'hllor itself has never treated Lightbringer as a settled matter of the past alone. Central to that faith is the belief that Azor Ahai will be reborn, that the hero who once forged Lightbringer to beat back an ancient darkness will come again when the darkness threatens to return, and that some sign, some fulfillment of old and half-remembered prophecy will mark his return when it comes.
This belief transforms the question of Lightbringer from a purely historical puzzle into something closer to a living expectation, held with real and evident sincerity by priests and believers who have, across many generations, looked for signs of that promised return in the events of their own troubled times. This telling will not evaluate whether that faith is well-founded, because questions of religious belief sit outside what any honest historical account, however careful, can confirm or deny. What can be said is only that the legend of Lightbringer has never, for the faithful of R'hllor, been merely a story about the deep past. It has remained, across 10,000 years, a promise about the future as much as a memory of what came before, which may be part of why it has traveled so far and endured so vividly, long after so much else from that same ancient darkness has faded into little more than a bedtime story told to frightened children in the north.
Chapter 20. The Great Empire of the Dawn. Far to the east, in lands the Westerosi maesters have only ever glimpsed through traders' tales and travelers' accounts, older traditions describe an empire that predates almost everything this telling has spoken of so far, the Great Empire of the Dawn. According to tradition preserved in the far eastern lands of Yi Ti, this empire flourished in the deep past, ruled across a long and glorious succession of emperors, before falling, as tradition holds, through a catastrophe remembered as the Blood Betrayal, associated with a ruler called the Bloodstone Emperor, said to have seized power through dark and forbidden means, and to have brought down upon his own empire a darkness that, in some tellings, sounds remarkably similar to the long night this story has already described in its Westerosi form. Other emperors named in this same tradition, the Pearl Emperor, the Amethyst Empress, belong to the same deep and uncertain past, remembered in fragments, their exact relationship to one another and to the blood betrayal itself told differently depending on which Yitish source a traveler happens to encounter. This telling must stress, more firmly here than almost anywhere else in this story, how much of this rests on theory rather than established fact.
The Great Empire of the Dawn is known to Westerosi scholarship only second-hand, through travelers' accounts of Yitish tradition, themselves already several steps removed from whatever original history, if any single original history exists at all, lies beneath these stories. Whether the blood betrayal describes the same catastrophe as the Long Night, whether it describes a related but separate darkness, or whether it describes something with no true connection at all, beyond the very human tendency to imagine ancient falls from grace in broadly similar terms, none of this can be answered with confidence. This telling will not pretend otherwise. What can be said, a little more confidently, is that the traditions surrounding the Great Empire of the Dawn describe a civilization of extraordinary age and sophistication, said to have mastered arts and knowledge that later ages, even in Yi Ti itself, could no longer fully reconstruct or explain. This pattern, a golden age of lost knowledge, followed by catastrophic decline, followed by a long and difficult climb back toward anything resembling its former achievement, recurs often enough across the world's traditions that it is tempting to read it as more than mere coincidence. And yet this same pattern recurs, too, across countless real-world mythologies, with no plausible connection to one another at all, which is precisely why this telling continues to urge caution here rather than certainty.
It is worth noting, too, that the very obscurity of these Eastern traditions, filtered as they are through generations of travelers' second-hand accounts before ever reaching a Westerosi maester's careful notes, means that even the names given here, the Bloodstone Emperor, the Pearl Emperor, the Amethyst Empress, may themselves be imperfect translations or later inventions, layered on to whatever original figures, if any, first gave rise to these traditions in Yi Ti's own deep and largely unrecorded past. This telling repeats them because they are the names that have survived into the record available to us, not because their precision can be vouched for any more confidently than anything else in this long and uncertain chapter of the story.
Some scholars, cautiously, have wondered whether the great empire of the Dawn's tradition of a golden age undone by a single catastrophic ruler might in fact preserve, in a far more distorted form, a memory not of the Long Night at all, but of some earlier hardship altogether, or even, more speculatively still, of the founding of the very same civilization that the Long Night would later threaten, a memory of creation and fall folded together across so many additional centuries of retelling that any specific historical event has become almost entirely unrecoverable. This telling raises the thought only to illustrate how much room for interpretation this particular tradition leaves open, precisely because so little of it can be checked against any independent source. Where Westerosi tradition benefits from the physical presence of the wall itself, a structure any traveler can see and touch, however uncertain its precise origin remains, the great empire of the Dawn offers no comparable anchor. It survives purely as story, and must therefore be weighed, more than any other tradition this telling has discussed, as story alone.
Chapter 21. Yi Ti and the Long Night. The traditions of Yi Ti deserve to be heard in a little more of their own detail, both because they are genuinely fascinating in their own right, and because they offer this telling's clearest example of how differently two cultures can describe what might or might not be the very same ancient event. Where Westerosi tradition speaks of the Others, the Whites, the Wall, and the Night's Watch, Yi Tish tradition speaks instead of the Bloodstone Emperor's betrayal, of a darkness following his rise, and, in some versions, of a great and unnamed catastrophe that ended an entire golden age of their own deep history. The specific details differ substantially. There is no clear Yi Tish equivalent of the Others as a distinct supernatural people, no clear equivalent of a wall built specifically to hold back an undead army, and yet certain broad shapes recur, a golden age ending in darkness, a fall connected to pride or betrayal or forbidden power, a long period of suffering following that fall, and eventually, in most versions, some form of restoration or dawn following the darkness. This telling will ask the question plainly, because it is the honest question at the heart of this entire chapter, without pretending to answer it. Are the Westerosi Long Night and the Yi Tish blood betrayal describing the same global catastrophe, remembered differently by two cultures separated by half a world and thousands of years of retelling?
Are they describing related but genuinely separate events, perhaps connected only by whatever deeper and stranger power lay behind both? Or are they simply two unrelated traditions, each independently shaped by the very human tendency to imagine a lost golden age destroyed by hubris, a shape that recurs across countless real-world mythologies with no need for any single shared historical root at all? No surviving source answers this question, and this telling, true to its promise, will not force an answer where none exists. It will only say that the question itself is worth holding on to, quietly, the way an old mystery is worth holding on to even when, perhaps especially when, it can never be fully solved. It is worth adding one further layer to this question, gently, because it deepens rather than resolves it. Yi Ti itself, according to its own traditions, is a civilization of extraordinary age, said to have passed through dynasty after dynasty across a span of history even longer, in some tellings, than the 10,000 years Westeros claims for itself since the signing of the Pact. A civilization that old would very naturally accumulate many separate periods of hardship and recovery across its history, any number of which might, across enough centuries of retelling, begin to resemble one another,
and begin to resemble, too, hardships remembered by entirely unconnected peoples elsewhere in the world.
This telling raises this not to dismiss the comparison between Yi Ti's traditions and the Westerosi Long Night, but to note honestly that a civilization old enough may simply contain within its own history more than one candidate for what a distant and unfamiliar culture might later recognize, imperfectly, as an echo of its own darkest winter. Chapter 22: Asshai and the Darkness. Further east and south still, past even the furthest reach of common Yi Tish tradition, lies Asshai by the Shadow, a city of enormous age, said by every account to have stood for longer than memory can properly measure, and associated more closely than almost anywhere else in the known world with the legend of Azor Ahai himself. Asshai's own traditions are, if anything, more fragmentary and more resistant to confident summary than any others this telling has touched upon so far. Its people are said to practice magics darker and stranger than those known elsewhere, its scholars and shadowbinders keeping knowledge that rarely, if ever, travels beyond the city's own walls. What little does travel outward, the story of Azor Ahai and Lightbringer chief among it, arrives already so wrapped in centuries of retelling by outsiders that its original Asshai shape, whatever that shape once was, can no longer be recovered with any confidence. It is enough, for the purposes of this telling, to let Asshai remain what it has always been in every honest account, a place at the very edge of the known and knowable world, holding secrets that neither Westerosi maester nor Yi Tish scholar has ever fully drawn into the light.
Some mysteries, this story has already suggested more than once, are not failures of curiosity, but simply honest limits, places where the old darkness of the long night and the deeper darkness of unrecorded history finally meet, and where this telling, like every honest telling before it, must simply admit that it does not know, and let the mystery stand. Travelers who have journeyed there and returned, themselves a small enough number that their accounts vary wildly and cannot easily be checked against one another, describe a city built along a black and sluggish river, its stone the color of dried blood in some accounts, and the color of ash in others, its people quiet and watchful, its markets trading in goods and knowledge found nowhere else in the known world. Little of what its shadowbinders are said to practice has ever been described with any real specificity by outside sources, and this telling will not attempt to fill that gap with speculation of its own, since to do so would mean inventing a tradition rather than reporting one. What this telling will say, in closing this part of the story, is that Asshai's very unwillingness to explain itself may be, in a quiet way, the most honest response any culture has offered to the mystery of the Long Night at all.
Where Westeros built a wall, and the North kept its old and careful customs, and Yi Ti told stories of emperors and betrayal, Asshai, so far as anyone outside its walls has ever been able to say, has simply kept its silence. And there may be a kind of wisdom in that silence, that this telling, however many words it has already spent trying to explain what cannot fully be explained, can only quietly admire, and then, at last, allow to stand. The story returns now to Westeros, and to its ending, the part every listener has in some quiet way been waiting for since the very first chapter. Let whatever tension has gathered across this long telling begin gently to loosen. The worst is almost over.
Part 7. The Final War.
Chapter 23. The Gathering Darkness. By the time the Long Night reached what the old songs treat as its final and most desperate stage, the world it had begun in was already, in every meaningful sense, gone. This is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it explains so much of the fear and exhaustion that colors every account of this final period. Settlements that had endured the earliest years of cold and disappearance had, by this point, either fallen entirely silent or drawn inward,
abandoning outlying farms and hamlets to gather behind whatever walls could be defended. Kingdoms, to the extent that word applies to this early pre-unification Westeros at all, had, in many tellings, ceased to function as kingdoms in any ordinary sense, their lords and chieftains reduced to organizing whatever local defense they could manage, with little ability to coordinate across greater distances, in a world where travel itself had become slow, dangerous, and often simply impossible. Alliances between First Men and Children of the Forest, forged so carefully in the Pact centuries before, were tested now as never before, and the old songs suggest, without giving many specific details, that this final crisis did more than any single event before it to draw the two peoples together in genuinely combined defense, not because either side had forgotten their differences, but because neither side could any longer afford them.
And food, always the quiet undercurrent beneath every account of this war, had by this point become perhaps the single greatest danger of all, greater in many ways than the whites or even the others themselves. A people cannot fight indefinitely on empty stores, however brave, however well armed. The old stories describe hunger stalking alongside the darkness itself, a second enemy that needed no cold blade to kill. It was into this exhausted, fractured, half-starved world that the war's final and most legendary confrontation is said to have come. It is worth imagining, in this final stretch before that confrontation, what leadership itself must have looked like among the scattered people still standing. Tradition offers few names from this period with any confidence, but it offers, in its broader shape, a picture of authority reduced to its most essential and unglamorous form. Whoever could keep a hearth burning, whoever could organize a watch through the long dark hours, whoever could hold a frightened and hungry group of people together for one more day, and then another, without any promise of when the ordeal might end. Grand titles, to whatever extent they had existed at all in this early and loosely organized Westeros, would have mattered little against a crisis of this scale.
What mattered, this telling would gently suggest, was the far quieter and far harder work of simply keeping people fed and warm and willing to keep going. It is against this backdrop, too, that the deepening cooperation between First Men and Children of the Forest, touched upon in an earlier chapter, seems to have reached its fullest and most consequential expression. Whatever separate customs and separate histories still divided the two peoples in matters of daily life, the shared urgency of this final stretch of the war appears, from every angle the old traditions allow us to view it, to have overridden those older divisions almost entirely. Obsidian weapons, once traded cautiously and in small numbers between the two peoples, are said to have been shared far more freely in this period. Knowledge of the enemy's habits and weaknesses, hard won separately by each people across years of costly encounter, appears to have been pooled at last into something closer to a single shared understanding. It took the worst crisis either people had ever faced to fully complete what the Pact, so many centuries earlier, had only begun.
Picture, if you will, one particular gathering point of this final stretch, imagined rather than confirmed, because no single site survives in the record with enough detail to be described with certainty. Some great hall, or perhaps some ring of ancient weirwoods at the edge of the deep forest, where survivors from a dozen scattered communities are said, in fragments too vague to call history but too consistent across separate traditions to dismiss entirely, to have gathered in these final months. Old rivalries between neighboring holdfasts, tradition suggests, were set aside here with a speed that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. Children of the Forest, who had for centuries kept mostly to their own deep groves, even under the Pact's protection, are said to have come forward openly among First Men gatherings for perhaps the first time in living memory, offering counsel, offering weapons, offering whatever aid their old magic could still provide to a fight that had, by this point, become the only fight that mattered to anyone left alive. This telling offers this image gently and with appropriate caution, because it cannot be confirmed as literal history.
But it captures something the old songs insist upon again and again,
in whatever specific words a given telling happens to use, that whatever divided the peoples of that ancient world before the darkness came, the darkness itself, in the end, proved a stronger unifying force than any peace treaty or any shared custom ever had been. It took the very worst thing that had ever happened to bring out at last the very best that both peoples had to offer one another. Chapter 24. The Battle for the Dawn.
This telling arrives now, at the moment every account of the long night has been building toward, the battle for the dawn, remembered, where it is remembered at all in any specific form, as the final and decisive confrontation between the forces of humanity, allied with the children of the forest, and the others themselves. It must be said, honestly and without any softening, that almost nothing specific survives about this battle. No account gives a location that can be confidently placed on any map. No account gives troop numbers or named commanders beyond the shadowy and uncertain figure of the last hero. What survives instead is only the shape of the story, that humanity and the children, driven to the very edge of endurance, met the others in some final and total confrontation, and that dragonglass, the obsidian weapons the children had always favored, and which the first men had by this stage learned, through hard experience, to value as well, played a central role in whatever victory or survival was achieved. Some traditions connect this battle directly to the founding of the wall, suggesting that the wall itself was raised in the immediate aftermath, both as a monument to what had been endured and as a defense against whatever remained of the enemy that might yet return. Other traditions are vaguer still, offering only the barest sense that some final, terrible cost was paid, and that whatever was paid, it was enough, for a very long time at least, to end the darkness. This telling will not invent troop movements or heroic single combats that no source describes, however tempting it might be to fill this gap with more vivid detail. The honest truth is that the battle for the dawn survives, in the record available to us, almost entirely as an absence, a battle everyone agrees must have happened, remembered by its outcome far more clearly than by its events. And perhaps, in a story built so much around memory and forgetting, that absence is itself worth sitting with, rather than filling in. It is worth imagining, all the same, the sheer scale such a battle would need to have reached, given everything this telling has already described. If the whole of the surviving first men and children forces truly gathered into a single confrontation, as the songs at least broadly suggest, then this would have been unlike anything the ancient world had seen before, or, so far as the record shows, would see again for thousands of years afterward. The largest assembly of human and child of the forest strength the Pact-era world had ever produced, met by an enemy whose own numbers and true nature remained even at this final and most desperate hour only partly understood by those who stood against it.
Some later singers, unwilling to leave so vast a moment entirely unadorned, have offered their own invented details across the centuries, named champions, particular acts of heroism, precise accounts of where the battle was fought. This telling has deliberately chosen not to repeat those later inventions, as though they carried the same weight as the older and more honestly uncertain tradition, because doing so would blur exactly the line this whole telling has tried to hold steady from its very first page, the line between what can honestly be said to be remembered and what has simply been imagined afterward to fill a silence that the truth, whatever it was, left behind. Some of the most important things that have ever happened in any history are remembered less by their details than by the simple, undeniable fact that the world continued afterward.
Chapter 25. The Retreat of the Others.
Whatever happened at that final, unrecorded battle, the outcome is at least consistent across nearly every surviving tradition. The others retreated. The darkness, after what the old songs measure only vaguely as years upon years, began at last to lift. No account explains with confidence why the retreat happened when it did, rather than earlier or later, or why it happened at all, given how thoroughly the others seemed, by every account, to hold the advantage for so much of the war's later years.
Some traditions attribute it to the sacrifice associated with Azor Ahai and Lightbringer, folding that Eastern legend into the Westerosi ending, though this telling must note again how uncertain that connection remains. Some attribute it simply to the tremendous cost paid at the Battle for the Dawn, as though the others, whatever their true nature, could be worn down by loss the same way any army can be worn down, given enough time and enough resistance. And some of the oldest and most cautious accounts offer no explanation at all, preferring simply to record the fact of the retreat, without speculating further. A restraint this telling finds, honestly, rather admirable, and worth matching here, rather than inventing a tidier ending than the sources themselves are willing to offer.
What can be said, without straying into invention, is only this. The retreat was not, by any surviving account, described as total or permanent in the sense of an enemy destroyed outright. The others withdrew, back toward whatever cold and distant place they had come from, beyond the edge of the world the first men and the children could reach or fully understand. And it was in direct response to that retreat, not in celebration of a final victory, but in preparation against a threat that might someday return, that the greatest work of the following age was undertaken. It is worth pausing on this word retreat, because it carries a weight the old songs seem, in their own quiet way, to have understood even without stating it outright. A retreat is not a surrender. It does not imply an enemy destroyed, only an enemy withdrawn, for reasons of its own that the ones it withdrew from may never fully know. Whatever relief the ancient peoples of Westeros felt in that moment, and the old songs suggest it was profound and hard-won and entirely genuine, it seems to have been tempered, almost from the very start, by an equally profound and equally genuine wariness. The war, so far as anyone could tell, was over, but the enemy, so far as anyone could tell, was not gone.
It had simply gone back to wherever it had come from, and no one left standing in that exhausted world could say with any confidence that it would not, someday, choose to come back. This is, perhaps, the single most important emotional truth the entire long night bequeathed to every generation that followed it in the North, whether or not those later generations still remembered exactly why they felt it. A relief that never quite became complacency, a peace that never quite forgot the shape of the danger it had been won against. It is this same wary, watchful relief that would, in the following age, raise the greatest defensive structure the ancient world had ever built. Chapter 26. The First Dawn.
Let this chapter move more slowly than any before it, because it describes the moment the entire story has been quietly waiting for since its very first page. Picture, after so many long years of cold and darkness, the first true light beginning to return to the sky. Not suddenly, the old songs are careful to say, but gradually, the way any dawn arrives, a paling at the horizon before anyone dared quite believe it, a soft gray brightening by careful degrees into something that might, at last, be trusted as morning. Picture the snow, after years of unbroken cold, beginning at last to soften at its edges, water finding its way again along paths it had forgotten, rivers cracking free of ice with sounds the old songs describe as like distant thunder, though gentler and somehow full of relief rather than threat. Picture birds returning to skies that had held nothing but gray cloud and colder silence for years beyond counting. Small, ordinary birds, the kind no one would have thought to celebrate in any other circumstance, now watched from doorways and battlements with something very close to wonder. Picture green things, tentative and small at first, pushing up through half-frozen earth in places the war had passed over and left behind. Picture rivers running clear again.
Picture forests, weirwoods among them, shedding their long burden of snow,
their carved red faces catching, for the first time in years, something that could honestly be called sunlight. And picture the survivors, fewer, certainly, than the world had held before the darkness came, marked by loss in ways the songs do not need to specify for a listener to understand. Stepping out from behind walls and gates and shelters they had huddled inside for what had felt by then like an entire lifetime, blinking into a light none of them, by the end, had been entirely certain they would ever see again. This is the moment every hardship in this story has been building toward, and it deserves to be lingered over exactly this long, exactly this gently, because it is, in the end, the whole point of everything that came before it. Darkness came, and it was terrible, and it ended. Picture, too, the particular quality of sound in this first true dawn. Not silence, which had been the world's companion for so long by this point, but the slow and tentative return of ordinary noise. Water dripping from falling eaves. A child's laughter, unremarkable in any other age, remarkable now simply for existing at all. The creak of a gate, long frozen shut, finally worked open.
The old songs linger, more than on any battle, on these small and quiet sounds, as though the singers who first composed them understood, better than any historian could explain it, that this was the truest measure of what had been won. Not a victory counted and enemies destroyed, but a world quietly, gradually, remembering how to sound like itself again. And picture, last of all, the weirwoods themselves in this moment, their carved red faces catching real sunlight for what may have been the first time in years. Whether they watch this moment in any sense a living creature watches, whether some faint awareness lingered in that ancient network of roots and carved faces, and felt, in whatever way trees can be said to feel, the warmth finally returning, this telling cannot say with confidence. But it offers the image gently, because it feels, somehow, like the right image to close this chapter on. An old and patient watcher, having endured the very worst of the darkness alongside everyone else, finally allowed to feel the sun again. Rest here a moment, if you need to, before the story moves into its quieter, gentler second half. The war is over now. What remains is simply the long, patient work of remembering it, and of slowly, carefully letting it go.
Part 8. After the Long Night.
Chapter 27. Rebuilding the World.
What little the surviving record allows us to say about the years immediately following the Long Night must be said carefully, because so much of it can only be inferred rather than confirmed outright. It seems reasonable to imagine, and consistent with the broader shape of the tradition, that the world which emerged from the darkness was a diminished one. Fewer people, fewer settlements, entire communities that simply never recovered from years of cold and loss. Rebuilding, where it happened at all, likely happened slowly and unevenly, some regions recovering more quickly than others, some never quite returning to whatever they had been before the winter came. The alliance between first men and children of the forest, tested so severely by the war, seems, from what tradition suggests, to have held rather than broken in this period, perhaps strengthened even by everything the two peoples had endured and survived together. This telling will not claim more specific knowledge than this, because the sources themselves offer little more. What matters most, for the purposes of the larger story, is simply that the world continued. People returned to farming. Halls were rebuilt or repaired. Children were born into a world that, whatever its losses, was no longer actively dying.
And in the North specifically, in the aftermath of everything that had happened there, one project above all others absorbed the energy, the memory, and the fear of an entire generation, making certain that whatever had retreated into the far north would never again be able to return unchallenged. It is worth imagining, too, how differently this rebuilding must have been experienced depending on where in Westeros a given community found itself.
In the far south, if the darkness reached that far at all, with anything like the severity felt in the north, and this telling must note again how genuinely uncertain that question remains, recovery may have come more quickly, the memory of the long night fading into something closer to a distant and second-hand horror, a story told about the north rather than a hardship personally endured. In the north itself, by contrast, recovery seems to have been shadowed, for at least a generation or more, by a wariness that never fully lifted, a wariness that shaped, in ways this telling will describe more fully in the chapters ahead, the entire culture and self-understanding of the northern peoples for thousands of years afterward.
This difference, subtle as it may seem, may help explain something that puzzled later ages, and which this telling will return to more directly further on. Why the North, alone among the regions of Westeros, seems to have kept the memory and the customs of the Long Night alive with such stubborn persistence, long after the South had largely allowed the whole affair to soften into children's stories and half-believed superstition. The North, it seems, simply had further to fall, and remembered, longer than anyone else, exactly how far that fall had been. Consider, too, the particular texture of daily life in these first recovering years, the small, unglamorous work that rebuilding actually requires, so easily skipped over in a story that has, until now, been mostly concerned with darkness and war. Fields had to be cleared of the debris a long winter leaves behind, fallen and rotted timber, the bones of animals that had not survived, the remains of structures too damaged to repair and not worth the labor of tearing fully down. Seed stores, wherever any had been carefully preserved through the worst of the cold, would have been treated as treasures beyond price, portioned out with a care that no ordinary harvest ever required. Livestock had to be rebuilt from whatever scattered and depleted herds had survived, a slow process measured in years rather than seasons, since animals cannot simply be willed back into existence the way stores of grain can eventually be regrown from a single well-tended field. And there would have been, too, the quieter and harder work of simply relearning how to live without constant fear, a skill, oddly enough, that a people can lose almost as thoroughly as any practical craft after years spent in a state of near constant vigilance. Tradition offers little detail on this particular recovery, since it belongs to the kind of quiet, internal healing that rarely makes for dramatic song. But it is worth imagining, all the same, a generation of children growing up in this recovering world, taught constant caution by parents who had lived through something those children themselves would only ever know secondhand, learning to carry forward a wariness whose original cause they had never personally witnessed. The seed, in this small and human way, of exactly the inherited caution that would define the North for so many thousands of years to come.
Chapter 28. The Wall.
This telling has already spoken of Brandon the Builder and the traditions surrounding him, but it is only here, after the long night itself has been told in full, that the true purpose of his greatest work can be properly understood. The wall, tradition holds, was built, or at least substantially completed, in the years following the long night's end, though some traditions push its origin earlier, into the war itself, suggesting it may have been begun as a desperate defensive measure even before the final battle was fought. Whichever version is closer to the truth, and this telling cannot say with confidence, the purpose attributed to the wall across every surviving tradition is consistent and unambiguous. It was raised to hold back whatever remained of the others, to mark and defend the boundary between the realms of men and whatever cold power still existed beyond it. Its scale, hundreds of feet high and hundreds of miles long, reflects the seriousness with which that generation took this threat, a seriousness that would gradually fade, tradition suggests, as centuries passed without the enemy returning, until eventually. This telling must be honest about this too, because it matters for a chapter much later in the story. The wall's true purpose came to be doubted, even mocked, by people who had never known true winter and had no memory, personal or inherited, of what it had once been built to stop.
Whether the wall possessed genuine magical properties, as many traditions claim, some form of old magic worked into its ice by the children of the forest, meant to actively resist the passage of the others, rather than simply serving as a physical barrier, cannot be confirmed with confidence. It remains, honestly, one of the more persistent uncertainties surrounding the entire history of the Long Night, a structure whose scale suggests desperate seriousness, built by people who, by every surviving account, believed absolutely in the danger they were guarding against. Consider, too, the sheer strangeness of maintaining such a structure across 10,000 years, long after the immediate memory of why it had been built began to fade. Every generation of the Night's Watch inherited not only the physical task of patrolling and repairing so vast a wall, but the harder and quieter task of believing in its purpose, without the benefit of ever having seen that purpose truly tested. This is, in its way, one of the more remarkable and underappreciated feats contained within this whole long story, an institution that continued its watch faithfully across roughly 400 generations, most of them never once encountering the enemy they had sworn to guard against, and many of them growing, understandably, to doubt that enemy had ever truly existed at all. And yet the watch continued regardless, sustained by oath and habit and a kind of institutional memory that outlasted the personal memory of any single family many times over. Later ages would come to see this endurance as either deeply admirable or faintly absurd, depending on how seriously a given lord or scholar took the old stories the watch had been founded to guard against. This telling will not judge between those two views. It will only note that whichever view was correct, the wall itself stood the same, hundreds of feet of ancient ice, indifferent to whether the people beneath it believed in the reason it had been built, waiting, the way old and patient things wait, for whatever might eventually come to test it again.
Chapter 29. The Night's Watch.
Alongside the wall came the order sworn to guard it, and this telling should give the Night's Watch its own quiet space here, because an order that endures for 10,000 years, whatever else changes around it, deserves to be understood as more than a footnote to the structure it guards. Tradition holds that the watch was founded in the direct aftermath of the Long Night, its earliest members drawn from among those who had fought hardest against the others, and best understood what still might lie beyond the wall. Some versions connect its founding directly to the last hero, suggesting his final vow, after all his losses, became the model for the vow every brother of the watch has sworn ever since. A vow of total commitment, surrendering family, land, and title, in exchange for a single purpose, standing guard for as long as it might be needed against a darkness that everyone in that first generation still remembered vividly enough to take entirely seriously. The watch's original purpose, then, was never merely to guard against the wildlings beyond the wall, whatever role that task would come to play in later, more peaceful centuries, when the true old enemy seemed to belong entirely to legend. Its original purpose, so far as tradition can be trusted at all on this point, was singular and vast, never again to be caught unprepared, as the ancient peoples of Westeros had been caught, by a darkness with no name and no warning. The vows sworn by every brother of the Watch, preserved across 10,000 years, with a consistency that itself suggests how seriously that first generation intended them to be kept, speak to exactly this purpose, if a listener attends closely to their words, rather than their familiar rhythm. A man who takes the black surrenders title and family and the ordinary rewards of an ordinary life in exchange for a single unbroken commitment to watch through every long night that might come for a danger that most of his descendants would never see with their own eyes, and increasingly, as centuries passed without incident, would come to doubt was real at all. It is worth imagining what it must have meant to be among the earliest brothers of this order, men and women in some of the oldest traditions who had themselves lived through the long night, who needed no old song to convince them why this vow mattered, because they carried the memory of the reason in their own bodies and their own grief. For them, the watch was not superstition, nor ritual, nor inherited habit.
It was simply, plainly, the only sensible response to something they had seen with their own eyes and had no wish for their children or their children's children ever to see again. The Night Fort, tradition holds, was the first, and for a long while the greatest of the castles built along the wall to house this order, and later ages would come to regard it with a particular unease that set it apart even from its sister castles, a place where, across 10,000 years, an unusual number of dark and half-believed stories accumulated, involving everything from cannibalism during some later and lesser famine to a bell said to ring on its own on the coldest nights, warning of dangers that never quite seemed to have been named clearly enough for later ages to fully understand what they were meant to warn against. This telling repeats these later legends, only to note how thoroughly the Night Fort, more than any other single structure along the wall, came to absorb the North's accumulated dread across the centuries, as though the fear that first built the wall never fully left that particular castle, however far the memory of its original cause drifted from the minds of the people who still, every generation, sent their sons to serve there. It is worth noting, too, how the Watch's membership itself changed across the centuries, in ways that reflect the slow fading of urgency this telling has already described. In its earliest days, tradition suggests, the Watch drew heavily from among the most respected and capable members of Northern society, men who took the black not as a punishment or a last resort, but as an honored calling, chosen deliberately for a purpose everyone still understood to be vital. In later, more peaceful ages, the Watch increasingly became, as most people in later Westeros knew it, a refuge for criminals and debtors and younger sons with no better prospects. A shift that speaks, more clearly than almost anything else in this whole long history, to how completely the original purpose of the Order had been allowed to fade from serious consideration, even as the Order itself and the vow at its heart endured unbroken.
Chapter 30. The Night's King. No figure connected to the North's ancient history has caused more confusion across centuries of retelling than the Night's King, and this telling must be especially careful here because it is exactly the kind of figure whose story is often folded, wrongly, into the Long Night itself, when the clearer traditions actually place him somewhat later. The story, in its most common form, tells of a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, his true name lost, deliberately erased from the Watch's own records, tradition says, as a mark of the shame he brought upon the Order, who fell in love with, or was ensnared by, a woman with skin cold as ice and eyes blue as a winter sky, and who, under her influence, turned against his own brothers, declaring himself Night's King and ruling for a time, cruelly, from the very wall meant to guard against the enemy he had apparently allied himself with. It is worth stating clearly, because so many retellings blur this distinction, that tradition generally treats the Night's King as a figure from a period after the original Long Night and the founding of the Watch, rather than as a participant in the original war this telling has been describing.
He represents, in most versions, a later betrayal, a later reminder that the old enemy had never been fully defeated, only held at bay, and his eventual overthrow, achieved through the combined efforts of the King of Winter and the King Beyond the Wall of that later age, working together in a fashion that itself echoes, deliberately or not, the older alliance between first men and children that had proven so vital during the Long Night itself. Whether the Night's King was a real historical figure, a garbled memory of some real and lesser crisis long after the Long Night's end, or purely a cautionary legend invented to warn future Watch members against exactly this kind of betrayal, cannot be settled with any confidence. What can be said is only that his story, whatever its factual basis, reinforced across every generation that heard it the same lesson the Long Night itself had already taught at far greater cost, that the old enemy beyond the wall was never something to be trusted or bargained with or forgotten. It is worth noting, too, the particular cruelty with which tradition treats the Night's King's memory, in ways that go beyond mere disapproval of his actions.
His name, in nearly every version of the tale, is said to have been struck deliberately from the Watch's own records, an act of erasure rather than mere silence, as though those who overthrew him wished not simply to punish him,
but to remove him from memory altogether, denying him even the grim permanence that even the worst villains of other Westerosi legends are usually allowed to keep. This is, in its way, a stronger statement than any detailed condemnation could have made, that some betrayals are considered so complete, so thoroughgoing, that the appropriate response is not to remember them vividly as a warning, but to try to forget the betrayer entirely, while keeping only the shape of the warning itself. Some later maesters have wondered whether this very deliberateness of the erasure is itself a clue to the tale's uncertain origins, whether a genuinely unnamed figure invites more legendary embellishment over time than a figure whose name and deeds were always known and simply retold. This telling offers that thought only as one more piece of the larger unresolved uncertainty running through this entire part of the story, not as any kind of settled answer. From here, the telling steps back a little, the way a historian steps back from a single old photograph to consider the whole dusty shelf of a family's history. The war has been told.
What follows is the story of the story itself, how something this vast came to be remembered, misremembered, doubted, and believed across 10,000 slow and patient years.
Part 9. How History Becomes Myth. Chapter 31. 10,000 Years of Forgetting.
It is worth pausing, before this telling moves into its most uncertain and speculative chapters, to consider the sheer scale of time separating the events already described from the much later age in which they came to be written down at all. 10,000 years, by the reckoning tradition assigns to the gap between the long night and the better recorded centuries that followed, is a span almost impossible to hold steady in the mind. It is longer, by a wide margin, than the entire recorded history of most real civilizations this listener's own world has ever produced. Across a gap that vast, even events of enormous and undeniable importance inevitably change shape, the way a stone in a riverbed is worn smooth by water that never stops moving, however slowly. History, in its first telling, tends to be specific. Names, places, numbers, causes, and effects laid out with whatever precision the original witnesses could manage. But history retold, generation after generation, by people further and further removed from the original events, naturally sheds specificity in favor of shape. Details that seem unimportant to one generation are dropped. Details that make for a better, more memorable story are kept, and sometimes embellished. Real, complicated, multi-decade struggles compress into single legendary battles. Countless unnamed acts of courage compress into a single legendary hero. This is not, this telling would gently suggest, a process of history being corrupted, so much as a process of history becoming something a people can actually carry forward across so vast a gap of time. A precise account of troop movements from 10,000 years ago would likely mean nothing to anyone alive today. A song about a lone hero walking into the frozen dark to save his people, sacrificing everything, still means something, still teaches something, however uncertain its factual foundation may have become along the way. It is worth considering, too, how differently this process of forgetting unfolds depending on who is doing the remembering. A great house with its own maester and its own careful records might preserve a more exact, if still incomplete, account of a given period than a small folk village relying entirely on oral tradition passed parent to child. And yet it is often the small folk tradition, paradoxically, that preserves the emotional truth of an event most faithfully, even as it loses the precise names and dates a written record might have kept. Because a story told aloud around a fire to frighten children who need to understand why a custom matters is shaped by every retelling to hit exactly the note that keeps a listener's attention and keeps the lesson alive, even as the specific facts around that lesson soften and blur.
This is, perhaps, the deepest reason the long night survives at all, in any form, after 10,000 years. Not because it was carefully recorded by careful scribes, though some such records surely once existed and are now lost,
but because it was told and retold by parents to children around fires very much like the one this telling has imagined for you from its very first page, in a chain unbroken enough and urgent enough that even 10,000 years of inevitable erosion could not wear it down to nothing.
Chapter 32. What the Maesters Believe.
The Citadel, that great institution of scholars and healers whose maesters served throughout the great houses of Westeros in the ages long after the Long Night, has never spoken with one single voice about how much of this story to trust. Some maesters, tradition suggests, hold to what might be called a skeptical position, that the Long Night was likely a real historical winter, unusually long and severe, even by the standards of that world's irregular seasons, but that the others, the whites, and the entire supernatural apparatus of the story represent later invention, superstition layered onto a genuinely difficult but ultimately natural hardship by generations of frightened and imaginative storytellers. Other maesters, more numerous perhaps in the north than in the warmer south, have held the opposite view, that the consistency and detail of the old accounts, the physical existence of the wall itself, and the deep, genuine dread the old stories still provoke even after 10,000 years, all suggest something more than mere invention lies beneath the tradition, that something real and genuinely supernatural truly did happen, whatever specific details time may have altered along the way. This telling will not resolve this disagreement, because the sources themselves have never resolved it, and any confident answer this telling offered would be invention rather than honest history.
What can be said is only this. The disagreement itself has been a real and lasting feature of Westerosi intellectual life for centuries, a genuine and ongoing debate rather than a settled matter, and it would be dishonest to smooth that debate away in favor of a tidier ending than the historical record actually supports. It is worth noting, too, the particular institutional caution the Citadel has long been known for, a caution that shapes this debate in its own quiet way. Maesters are trained, above almost everything else, to be wary of claims that cannot be independently verified, and a supernatural enemy defeated 10,000 years ago by an unnamed hero with the aid of a vanished people's magic is, by any reasonable standard of evidence, a very difficult claim to verify at all. This institutional wariness has led many maesters, across many generations, to prefer the safer and more defensible position, that something real and difficult certainly happened, but that the specific supernatural elements of the tradition likely reflect embellishment rather than literal fact. And yet it is worth noting, too, that this same cautious institution has never gone so far as to formally deny the tradition either, and has, in fact, continued for 10,000 years to support and maintain a wall and a sworn order whose entire founding purpose rests on that same tradition being at least partly true. Whatever the Citadel's scholars have privately believed across the centuries, its institutions have behaved, consistently, as though the old stories were worth taking seriously enough to prepare against, which may be, in the end, the wisest position available to anyone honestly uncertain about a danger they cannot fully rule out. Chapter 33. The Different Long Nights.
Having already toured in earlier chapters the traditions of Westeros, the North specifically, Ashai, Yi, and the Great Empire of the Dawn, this telling can now draw those separate threads together, if only to lay them side by side, rather than to force them into a single unified story. Westeros remembers the others, the Whites, the Wall, and the Night's Watch, with the North holding the clearest and most detailed version of this tradition. Ashai remembers Azor Ahai and Lightbringer, a hero of fire meeting a darkness rarely described in the same specific supernatural terms as the others. Yi remembers the Bloodstone Emperor and the Blood Betrayal, a fall from a golden age connected only loosely and uncertainly to any specific undead army or icy enemy. And the deeper traditions of the Great Empire of the Dawn remain, even to Yi-Tish scholars themselves, among the most fragmentary and least agreed upon of all. Laid out honestly, side by side like this, these traditions resist easy unification.
They may describe a single global catastrophe, remembered in radically different shapes by cultures separated by half a world and thousands of years of independent retelling. They may describe several genuinely separate hardships and crises, later linked together only by scholars and singers eager to find a grand unified pattern where none, in truth, exists.
Or, most likely of all, and least satisfying to anyone hoping for a clean answer, they may represent some mixture of both, real related events at their core, wrapped in so many layers of independent cultural embellishment that no amount of careful comparison can now fully separate the shared truth from the local invention. This telling finds a certain quiet comfort in leaving the question exactly there, unresolved, because that unresolved quality is itself, in its own way, honest to how history so very old actually survives, not as a single clean thread, but as many different threads, frayed at their ends, that may or may not once have been woven from the very same cloth. It is worth adding, finally, a thought about why this comparison matters at all, beyond mere scholarly curiosity. If these traditions do describe, in some fashion, a single shared catastrophe, then the Long Night was never merely a Westerosi affair, a northern hardship of purely local significance. It was something that touched, in some form, the greater part of the known world, remembered differently by different peoples according to their own customs and their own gods, but rooted, however distantly, in the very same darkness.
There is something almost comforting in that possibility, strange as it may sound to say so about so terrible an event, that whatever this darkness was, it was not endured alone by one small and isolated part of the world, but was met, in one form or another, by peoples everywhere, each finding their own way through it, each eventually finding their own way back to the light. Whether that comfort is historically justified, or simply a hopeful reading of evidence too thin to bear the weight of it, this telling cannot say with confidence. But it offers the thought gently, all the same, because it is exactly the kind of thought that belongs to a story meant to be heard quietly, in the dark, by someone hoping, as so many listeners across so many generations have hoped before falling asleep to this very story, that whatever darkness the world has ever faced, it was never faced entirely alone. What follows is a gentler kind of chapter than most. Not new events, but old questions, gathered together and looked at honestly, one by one, without any pressure to answer them all. There is a particular comfort in an unanswered question, held quietly rather than forced shut. Let these questions rest that way now.
Part 10. The Mysteries.
Chapter 34. Who created the others? Of all the unanswered questions surrounding the Long Night, none is asked more often, or answered with less confidence, than the question of where the others themselves first came from. No surviving Westerosi tradition offers a clear origin story for the others as a people. They are simply present in the oldest accounts, already ancient, already established somewhere beyond the reach of the first men and the children alike, their true history as obscure to the ancient peoples who fought them as it remains to us now. Some later theories, and this telling stresses again that these are theories, offered cautiously by scholars and singers rather than confirmed by any source, have wondered whether the children of the forest themselves might bear some responsibility, whether some ancient working of magic, meant originally for some other purpose entirely, might have given rise, deliberately or by terrible accident, to the enemy that would later threaten children and first men alike. This telling will not endorse that theory as fact, because no source confirms it, and inventing a definite origin where the books themselves offer none would break the promise this telling made in its very first pages. What can be said honestly is only that the question remains genuinely open, argued over across 10,000 years by people no closer to a confirmed answer than we are tonight. It is worth noting, too, how uncomfortable this particular uncertainty has always made those who ally themselves most closely with the children of the forest's memory and legacy. If the children did, even unknowingly, have some hand in the others' making,
then the entire war that followed becomes a far more tragic story than a simple tale of invasion resisted. A story of consequences unintended and unforeseen, visited upon a peace that 4,000 years of the pact had otherwise kept faithfully. This telling raises the possibility only because honesty requires it be raised, not because any source confirms it strongly enough to be treated as more than one uncertain thread among several. The truer and safer thing to say, and the thing this telling will end this chapter on, is simply that the question of the other's origin remains, after 10,000 years, one of the oldest and least resolved mysteries the world of ice and fire has ever produced.
Chapter 35. Why did the others return?
Just as their origin remains unclear, so too does the deeper question of why the others came at all in that first long night, rather than remaining wherever they had rested for whatever centuries or millennia came before. Some traditions suggest a natural rhythm, a long and terrible cycle in which such darkness returns periodically across the vast span of centuries, whether or not anything humanity does provokes or delays it. Others connect their coming to some disruption of the old magic that had perhaps once kept the balance between the living world and whatever cold power the others represent. A disruption blamed, in various tellings, on the felling of werewoods during the war between the first men and the children, or on some other forgotten offense against the old ways whose exact nature no surviving account specifies. Neither explanation can be confirmed. Both remain honestly theory resting upon theory, offered across 10,000 years of storytelling by people trying, in the most human way possible, to make sense of a catastrophe that may, in the end, have had no cause that any mortal action could have prevented or invited at all. There is perhaps a third possibility worth naming, gentler than either of the others, and just as unconfirmed, that no cause exists at all, in the sense a grieving or frightened people naturally wants one to exist.
Some hardships, in every history this world or our own has ever produced, arrive without any clear reason a survivor can point to and say truthfully, this is why it happened, and this is what we must never do again to prevent its return. It may simply be that the long night was, in the deepest and least comforting sense, exactly what the ancient peoples of Westeros first feared it to be, a thing that came for reasons belonging entirely to itself, and that might, someday, simply come again, whether or not anyone left behind ever does anything at all to invite or prevent it.
Chapter 36. What really happened to Azor Ahai? The question of whether Azor Ahai was a real historical figure, and whether his story genuinely connects to the Westerosi Long Night at all, remains one of the most actively debated uncertainties in this entire history. Some hold that Azor Ahai and the Last Hero were the very same figure, remembered under two different names by two cultures separated by immense distance and time. Others hold that they were entirely separate figures from entirely separate traditions, linked only by the very human tendency to imagine a singular hero standing against a singular darkness. And prophecy itself complicates the matter further, since later religious tradition holds that Azor Ahai is destined to be reborn, a promise that transforms his story from pure history into something closer to living faith, a belief this telling will not evaluate, since matters of faith fall outside what any honest history, however careful, can confirm or deny. Adding still further to the uncertainty, some traditions closer to the north itself have wondered whether Azor Ahai's story reached Westeros only later, carried by travelers and eventually by the priests of R'hllor themselves, and was then, gradually and perhaps quite naturally, blended with the older and more local legend of the Last Hero, simply because the two stories resembled one another so closely in shape. A hero, a darkness, a great sacrifice, a restored dawn.
If this is what happened, then Azor Ahai and the Last Hero may never have been the same figure at all, in any historical sense, but two separate cultural memories that later storytellers, delighting in the resemblance,
chose to weave together for the sake of a richer and more resonant telling. This telling cannot say which possibility is correct. It offers both, honestly, because both remain genuinely alive in the tradition, argued over by singers and scholars alike for longer than either side has ever come close to winning the argument outright.
Chapter 37. Was Lightbringer a sword?
This telling has already explored the competing literal and symbolic readings of Lightbringer in an earlier chapter, but the question deserves to be named again here, plainly, among this story's other great unresolved mysteries, precisely because no resolution exists. Perhaps it was a physical blade, forged in fire and grief exactly as the songs describe. Perhaps it was never a sword at all, but a name given, long after the fact, to whatever combination of courage, sacrifice, and desperate resistance actually turned back the darkness. This telling will let the question rest exactly there, neither confirmed nor dismissed, a mystery the old world itself was never able to solve any more fully than we can tonight. It is worth noting, as one final thought on this particular mystery, how naturally a people recovering from true catastrophe might reach for exactly this kind of story. Not because they wish to deceive future generations, but because some experiences resist being described in purely literal terms, and demand instead a symbol large enough to hold their true weight.
A sword forged through the death of someone deeply loved, capable of driving back an endless winter, is, whether or not it ever existed as a literal object, a symbol perfectly suited to carrying forward the truth of what survival during the long night likely required of everyone who lived through it. Unbearable loss, transformed against all reasonable expectation into the very thing that made continued survival possible at all.
Chapter 38. Was the long night worldwide?
The comparison of traditions across Westeros, Ashai, Yi Ti, and the great empire of the Dawn raises this question directly. Did the darkness fall across the entire known world at once, or only across Westeros, with other cultures' similar-sounding traditions describing entirely separate hardships that merely resemble one another in shape? No source settles this. The consistency of a darkness and restoration pattern across so many distant cultures might suggest a single shared catastrophe. It might equally suggest nothing more than the shared human tendency to imagine loss and recovery in broadly similar terms, the way flood myths recur independently across countless unconnected cultures in our own world, without requiring a single shared flood to explain them. It is worth considering, too, what a truly worldwide darkness would have meant practically, given how little the known world's various peoples were in regular contact with one another in that ancient age.
If the long night touched Westeros and Ashai and Yi Ti and the great empire of the Dawn all at once, it would have done so without any of these peoples knowing, at the time, that the others were suffering the very same fate. Each culture facing what must have felt to those living through it like the ending of their own particular world, with no way of knowing that, at that same moment, half a world away, other peoples were enduring something that may have looked remarkably similar. There is something almost unbearably lonely in that image, and something almost comforting in it as well, in the way this telling has already suggested once before. A shared darkness, endured entirely apart, each people believing themselves alone in it, until centuries later, travelers' tales began, slowly and uncertainly, to suggest otherwise.
Chapter 39. How long did it really last?
The old songs measure the long night's duration only vaguely. A generation, some say. Others speak simply of years beyond counting, without ever settling on a number that later maesters have been able to treat as reliable. This vagueness is, in its own way, itself a kind of evidence, a catastrophe genuinely severe enough to blur a people's sense of time passing, severe enough that counting years accurately mattered less in the moment than simply surviving each one. Later attempts to assign the long night a specific length in years remain guesswork, offered with varying degrees of confidence by different maesters across different ages, none of them more trustworthy than the honest admission that nobody, in the end, can say for certain how long the darkness truly lasted. It is worth remembering, too, the peculiarity of Westeros's naturally irregular seasons in trying to assess this question at all. In a world where an ordinary winter might already last several years without any supernatural cause whatsoever, distinguishing an unusually long ordinary winter from the beginning of something far worse would have been difficult even for people watching closely for exactly that danger.
This may be part of why the old accounts are so vague on duration specifically, not because the survivors could not count, but because the very thing that made this winter so uniquely terrifying, its refusal to end on any timeline an ordinary winter should have followed, is also, by its nature, an experience that resists precise measurement, since the people living through it had no reliable prior winter to measure it against in the first place.
Chapter 40. What was the Battle for the Dawn?
This telling has already described the Battle for the Dawn as best the sources allow in an earlier chapter, and returns to it here only to state plainly what this whole section of mysteries has been building toward, that the Battle for the Dawn may be the single clearest example in this entire history of an event everyone agrees mattered enormously, remembered almost entirely through its outcome rather than its details. Perhaps that is fitting. Some victories are too costly, too vast, too painful to be recounted in specifics by the very people who survived them. Perhaps the silence surrounding the Battle for the Dawn is not a failure of memory at all, but a kind of mercy the survivors chose, deliberately, to extend to themselves. This telling would like to close this whole long section of unresolved mysteries with a small observation that applies to every question raised within it. It would be easy, having spent so many chapters naming what cannot be known, to feel that this uncertainty represents some kind of failure, a story left incomplete, a history poorly kept. But there is another way to hold this same uncertainty, one this telling would gently offer instead, that a mystery preserved honestly, rather than filled in with comfortable invention, is itself a form of respect for whatever truth actually happened, however lost to us that truth may now be.
The people who lived through the long night deserve to have their story told as truthfully as the surviving record allows, gaps and all, rather than smoothed into a tidier shape, simply because a tidier shape makes for an easier telling. This story has tried, from its very first page, to offer you that respect. It hopes, in these final chapters, to close by offering you something gentler still. The story now leaps forward across nearly the whole of its 10,000 remembered years to a Westeros much closer to the one whose name you may already know, a Westeros of the Iron Throne and the Great Houses, and eventually a wall grown old and doubted, guarded by an order that had almost forgotten what it was truly guarding against. Part 11. The Modern World. Chapter 41. The World Has Forgotten. By the time of the events better known to most people who have heard of Westeros at all, the reigns of the later Targaryen kings, and beyond them the turbulent years in which a young Lord Commander named Jon Snow took the Black, in which a boy named Bran Stark journeyed north of the Wall seeking the last of the Greenseers, in which a queen named Daenerys Targaryen crossed the narrow sea with the last living dragons in the world. The long night had become, for most people south of the Wall, exactly what this telling warned at its very outset it would become. A bedtime story, a superstition, a tale the small folk still half believed, and the great lords of the South had mostly stopped believing at all. This telling will not describe how these later events concluded, both because the published record of them remains genuinely unfinished, and because inventing an ending that does not yet officially exist would break, more completely than anything else this telling could do, the promise made at its very beginning. What can be said, honestly, is only that these later figures inherited, whether they always recognized it or not,
the same old fear the ancient peoples of the North had once organized their entire lives around, and that the Wall, the Night's Watch, and the old words sworn by every brother who ever took the black, all trace back, in an unbroken, if increasingly doubted line, to the darkness this telling has spent so long describing. It is worth noting, too, just how far that doubt had traveled by these later ages, especially in the South, where the others had long since become little more than a nursery tale, a superstition the great lords of King's Landing and the fertile southern kingdoms found faintly ridiculous when they thought of it at all. This doubt itself is, in its own way, the final and most complete measure of everything this telling has tried to say about how history becomes myth. A threat that had once nearly ended the entire world had, across 10,000 years of peace, been worn down so thoroughly in memory that the very people whose ancestors owed their lives to those who fought it could no longer quite bring themselves to believe it had ever been real at all. Only in the North itself, and among the Night's Watch that never stopped keeping its long and increasingly lonely vigil, did the old fear remain close enough to the surface to still be taken, by at least some, entirely seriously.
Chapter 42. The Return of Winter.
Winter, in the world of ice and fire, has never been merely weather. It carries, in every telling of every generation, an echo of that first and worst winter, the one that never seemed like it would end. When later generations spoke the old stark words, "Winter is coming," they spoke them, whether they fully remembered why or not, as a warning passed down from people who had once lived through a winter that nearly ended the world entirely. This telling will simply note the echo and let it stand without further elaboration, that whatever winters came in later, better recorded ages, they were always understood at some deep and half-forgotten level against the memory of the very first one. It is worth noting, gently, how a phrase so simple as "winter is coming" can carry, across 10,000 years, so much more weight than its plain words suggest on their own. To a southern lord who had never known true hardship, it might mean little more than an inconvenience to be planned around, stores to be laid in, travel to be curtailed. To a Stark who had grown up hearing the old stories told properly, with the old warnings still attached, it meant something closer to a vow renewed, a reminder that vigilance, once let go entirely, might not be so easily recovered when it was needed again. The words never changed across all those centuries.
What changed, slowly and by degrees, was how fully the people speaking them still understood what those words had once been spoken to prevent. It is worth considering, too, how strange it must have felt, in those later, better recorded centuries, to be among the very few who still took the old words entirely literally, surrounded by neighbors and even kin, who had come to treat them as little more than a formal and slightly old-fashioned family motto. Tradition suggests this was increasingly the Starks' particular and lonely burden as the ages passed, to be a great house of the realm, respected and powerful in its own right, and yet also, quietly, the keeper of a warning that fewer and fewer people around them still believed needed keeping. There is something worth sitting with in that image. An entire house, across 10,000 years, holding fast to a caution that grew steadily less fashionable, steadily more likely to be gently mocked by southern lords who had never spent a true winter north of the neck, and holding to it anyway, generation after generation, simply because it had always been held, and because letting it go, even once, felt like too great a risk to take on behalf of everyone who might come after.
Chapter 43. The Old Stories Were Warnings.
It is worth ending this part of the telling with a gentler thought than most of what has come before it, that myths, however embellished, however worn smooth by 10,000 years of retelling, often preserve something true at their core, even when every specific detail around that core has long since been reshaped by time. A people who tell their children, generation after generation, to burn their dead rather than simply bury them,
are very likely preserving the memory of a real and terrible lesson learned at real and terrible cost. A people who build a wall of that scale and maintain an order sworn to guard it for 10,000 years without any confirmed sighting of the enemy it was built against are very likely preserving something more than idle superstition. The old stories, this telling would gently suggest, are so often warnings dressed as entertainment, a way of carrying forward, across gaps of time too vast for ordinary memory to survive, the one lesson a people could not afford to lose.
This is, perhaps, the single most valuable thing an old sleep story like this one can offer a listener drifting toward rest tonight. Not merely a pleasant tale to pass the dark hours, but a reminder that the oldest stories, the ones told so many times they have worn smooth at the edges, so often carry within them something true enough and important enough that an entire people once thought it worth preserving across every possible gap of memory and time, purely so that it would not be lost. Whatever specific details of the long night have blurred or vanished across 10,000 years of retelling, the shape of the lesson has endured. That hardship, however total it may seem in the moment, has always, in every telling of every people, eventually given way to dawn, and that the surest way through a long night is not to face it alone, but together, the way the first men and the children of the forest, in the end, chose to face theirs. And now, at last, the story comes home, back to where it began, back to the ancient forest and the first quiet shadows, back to the fire this telling has kept burning gently beside you for so long now. Let your own eyes rest, if they have not already. There is nothing left to carry forward from here but a single, soft, final image.
Part 12. The Final Sleep Story. Chapter 44. The Long Night Remembered.
Let this telling return now, one last time, to where it began, to the ancient forests of Westeros, unbroken and endless, the weirwoods standing watch in their carved and quiet groves. Let it imagine the children of the forest once more, small and dappled among the leaves, singing in a tongue no one living can still speak. Let it imagine the first men arriving, the long, slow war that followed, and the pact that ended it, struck upon a small island in a wide, still lake. Let it imagine the age of heroes, the builders and the founders, Brandon raising his great works in stone and ice. Let it imagine the first whispers of something pale and cold at the edge of the northern dark, the first winter that would not end, the first terrible discovery that the dead no longer stayed still. Let it imagine the last hero, walking alone into the white wilderness, his companions gone, his hope worn thin, carrying forward anyway. Let it imagine the children in their deep and ancient groves, choosing, in the end, to stand beside the first men, rather than apart from them. Let it imagine Azor High, far to the east, forging his sword through sacrifice too heavy for any single heart to carry lightly.
Let it imagine the others themselves, one final time, not to frighten at this late hour, but simply to remember, the way this whole telling has tried to remember everything honestly. Pale and cold and ancient, an enemy from a place no map has ever fully charted, met by a world that did not choose this war, but endured it anyway. And let it imagine at last the dawn. Chapter 45. Dawn After Darkness. Slow everything down now. All the way down. The way the final page of any long night's telling should slow. A quiet forest, snow settling softly from bent branches as the air begins at last to warm. Pale sunlight
finding its way between old and ancient trunks, touching ground that has not felt real warmth in longer than anyone left alive can clearly remember. Birds, somewhere close, beginning again their ordinary, unremarkable, and entirely wonderful morning songs. Survivors moving slowly out from behind walls that had held for as long as walls could be asked to hold, blinking into a light they had almost stopped believing they would ever see again. The world, in this final and gentlest image, does not celebrate loudly. It does not need to. It simply, quietly begins again. Fields resown, halls rebuilt, children born into a world where winter, however long it may yet return to trouble future generations, was no longer this winter, this darkness, this particular and unrepeatable night. Let this final image linger a moment longer still, because it is the one this whole telling has been walking toward from its very first sentence.
Somewhere in that quiet returning world, an old man who lived through the very worst of it sits by a low fire, much as you might be resting now, and begins, for perhaps the first time, to tell a child what happened, carefully, gently, leaving out whatever details a child does not need to carry, keeping only the shape of it. That darkness came, and people were afraid, and they held on to one another, and the light came back. That telling became another telling, and then another, across 10,000 years, each one a little softer than the one before, each one carrying forward not the precise and terrible truth in all its detail, but something gentler, and in its own way just as true, that whatever comes, however long it lasts, morning eventually finds its way back.
Final passage.
The long night happened so long ago now that almost everyone alive today has forgotten it entirely. Forgotten it not through carelessness, but simply through the ordinary, gentle erosion that time works on every memory, however important, given enough centuries to work with. And perhaps that, in the end, is the most haunting part of this whole long story. Not that the darkness came, not that the dead walked, or that a whole world nearly ended beneath an endless winter sky, but that the world survived that darkness, survived it fully, completely, against every reasonable expectation such a catastrophe should have allowed. And then, slowly, gently, the way all old and painful things eventually are, forgot. There is something almost comforting in that forgetting, if you let yourself sit with it a while, here in the dark, the way this whole story has asked you to sit with so much else tonight. It means the world went on. It means summers returned, long and warm and unremarkable, exactly the kind of summers that make old winters feel, eventually, like something that could not possibly happen again. It means children were born, who never needed to be afraid the way their ancestors once were, who could hear this very story instead as nothing more than a tale to fall asleep to, rather than a warning they needed to carry with fear into their waking hours.
Somewhere, beyond the wall, beyond the edge of every map, the ancient dark may still be resting, patient, the way it perhaps always has. But that is a worry for daylight, if it is a worry at all. Tonight, there is only this, an old world, once nearly lost, now simply and quietly at peace. Snow settling softly outside some window that does not exist except in this telling. A fire burning low and warm. And morning, whenever it chooses to come, arriving gently, the way it always eventually does.
Let every hard thing this telling has carried you through tonight settle now, the way snow settles after a long fall, quiet and complete. The war is over. The dead have been given their rest and stayed at rest. The last hero, wherever his long walk finally ended, is remembered kindly and does not need to be found for his story to have mattered. The children of the forest sing somewhere still, in a tongue no one now living can speak, and that is all right. Some songs are allowed to simply exist, unheard, and still be true. The wall stands, patient and vast and cold, and does not need watching quite so closely tonight. Because tonight, in this telling, the dawn has already come and stayed. There is nothing more this story needs to ask of you. No lesson left to learn before you rest. No warning left to carry into your dreams.
Only this, offered as gently as it can be offered. An old world, forgiven its long winter, breathing quietly in the dark. Exactly the way you are welcome to breathe now. Slower and slower still, until the telling itself fades, the way all good and old stories eventually fade, into something softer than words. Sleep well.